Chapter 2016. Meg sat behind the bar counter, munching on sunflower seeds as he listened to the two men drinking and reminiscing about their good and drinking friends. The wine was good, and the dishes went well with the wine. After downing half a bottle of Mai Tai, the two of them began to talk nonsense in their drunken stupor. Even Andre was mocked by them. As an interrogator, Meg wouldn't let go of such an opportunity. He went up to them and sat down at their table. Who are you? Why are you sitting with us? Lucien was still wary as he tilted his head and looked at Meg. Here. Have another glass. Meg helped him fill up the glass and then shoved it into his hand. Lucien raised the glass to his mouth mechanically and finished it in one gulp. His drunken eyes became even more blurry as he put his arm around Meg's shoulder and slurred. Where were we just now? We were talking about Josh coming to the court of the Ministry of War and summoning all the officials in the name of His Majesty, Meg said. Yes, His Highness Josh gathered all the officials in the Ministry of War and then took out His Majesty's card to order the border troops to attack the orcs and elves. What did the Ministry of War do? I'm just following the rule that His Majesty set back then, and following His Highness Joshua's instructions, I issued the order. Lucien covered his face and sobbed for a while. He couldn't help but cry. But the ones who were convicted were the loyal officials of the Ministry of War, and the ones who died were their family members. How could this be? Under Meg's persuasion, Lucien, a big shot in the Ministry of War, began to pour out his grievances. He told him the inside story of this incident and Andre's attitude. It was first-hand information that even Chaos City might not be able to get. Half an hour later, Meg went out and called Lucien's coachman and guards in to carry the two drunk men away. Our business for the day is over. Meg watched as the horse-drawn carriage disappeared into the distance. He flipped over the wooden plaque hanging on the door. He had gained quite a lot of information today. He now had a rough understanding of the current situation in the Roth Empire. Closed again? Is it so boring for rich people to open taverns? AI Faye couldn't help but mutter when she saw the scene of Meg flipping the wooden sign and entering the door while sending a drunken guest out. Compared to being so busy every day, she also wanted to experience this kind of boring life. AI Faye sighed. Alas, it's a pity that we're late. We're leaving now. Irina came down from upstairs and had already finished changing. She wore a tight black night suit, which perfectly highlighted her curvaceous figure. Please wait a moment. Meg went upstairs and changed into a set of black clothes. However, he was wearing a large black robe, and the shadow cast by the huge hat completely covered his face. He lowered his hat. Irina looked at his face and was slightly surprised. Do we look alike? Meg asked with a smile. How did you do it? Irina went up to touch his face. Meg went upstairs and actually disguised himself as Josh. It was almost exactly the same. I got a mask previously. After wearing it, I can imitate anyone's appearance, Meg explained. Oh, Irina thought for a while and said, then you can also imitate me. Meg pondered and said, theoretically, it's not a problem. TSK. Tell me, have you done anything shameful with this mask in the past? Irina asked with a smile. I don't cross-dress. Meg quickly waved his hands. Irina smiled and took out her magic caster's staff. Then let's go. A golden light flashed, and the two of them disappeared from the tavern. At home? Yes, in the manor. But there's a 10th tier knight guarding outside his room. Leave the knight to me and Bloom to you. Take care of the details. We only have 3 minutes. Let's go. 2 shadows flitted across the sky above the general's manor. Did you see anything floating by just now? Your eyes must be playing tricks on you. Or did you pay too much last night? It's too fake, the 2 guards outside the walls mumbled. After Meg and Irina entered the manor, they split up. The plan this time was called Kill Bloom. Of course, killing him was not the goal. How to frame Josh for his death was the key to their plan. Meg's target was that 10th tier knight, and the task of killing Bloom was left to the special effects master and light master Irina. She was to present a large-scale horror film directed by Meg for Bloom. Mag squatted on a nearby tree branch as he looked at the 10th tier knight sitting at the entrance of the room. His long sword was propped up beside him, and even though his eyes were closed, he could still sense the knight's powerful aura. He recognized this knight. Lear was a powerful knight in the military. He was an upright person and was not Bloom's confidant. He should have been sent to Bloom's manor by Andre to protect him. At this distance, Meg was confident that he could kill him with a flying sword. However, such a flashy way of killing would easily make others think of him. Furthermore, he did not intend to kill Lear. This knight's reputation was very good among the 10th tier knights. It was not worth it for him to die for a villain like Bloom. Therefore, Meg directly jumped out and walked toward Lear, who was sitting at the door. A series of black shadows appeared behind him. Don't panic. These were all special effects. Meg bought them from the system. They were usually used as special effects on stage. At the same time, a bowl-shaped barrier slowly rose up and enveloped the courtyard, temporarily isolating it from the outside world. The knight who had his eyes closed all this time suddenly opened his eyes. At the same time, he grasped the long sword beside him. Looking at the black-robed man who was approaching step by step like a ghost, he slowly stood up and shouted with a dignified expression, "Who are you?" "Kiki." The black-robed figure let out a ghostly cackle and suddenly accelerated toward the knight. The knight held his sword with both hands and also charged toward the black-robed figure. At the same time, he issued a warning for help. The two of them were dozens of meters apart, and they clashed in the blink of an eye. The knight held his sword with both hands and slashed it forward. A terrifying sword intent rose from the sword, as if it could tear through everything. However, the black-robed figure was like a ghost. He glided past the long sword, and apart from a corner of his clothes being cut off, he was completely unharmed. The knight's expression changed. He wanted to turn his long sword around, but something hot stabbed into his back, and he suddenly fell forward. "Ah, Josh!" Right at this moment, a blood-curdling scream suddenly sounded from the house behind. "General!" The knight's expression changed. Ignoring the pain in his back, he turned back to look. Bloom's bedroom had been set ablaze. The flames were burning fiercely and were quickly spreading out. "Bastard!" The knight raised his sword and pounced toward the black-robed figure. Although the black-robed figure moved like a ghost, he was still cut a few times. Suddenly, he flashed back, and the wide black robe suddenly fell back, revealing his face. "Your Highness Josh!" The knight was shocked and subconsciously stopped in his tracks. The black-robed figure fled in a panic and rushed into the fire, disappearing without a trace. End of chapter. Chapter 2017. Enemy attack. Put out the fire. Lear came to his senses and rushed into the burning bedroom with his heavy sword. He swatted away the fallen wood with his long sword and rushed into the fire. After the invisible barrier disappeared, the guards of the general's manor also discovered the abnormality here and all rushed over with buckets and swords to put out the fire. Not long after, Lear, whose hair was mostly burnt by the fire, rushed out of the fire with a body in his arms. All of the guards gathered around him and used water to put out the flames on Lear's body before turning to look at the general in Lear's arms. General Bloom, who was originally very muscular, was now only skin and bones. All of his blood essence seemed to have been sucked dry by something, and his expression was extremely horrified, as if he had seen something extremely terrifying. His eyes were wide open even in death. Lear was in a hurry to save people in the fire, so he didn't notice. Now that he saw Bloom in his arms, he was so shocked that he threw him out. "This! Great General, what happened to you?" All of the guards also hurriedly retreated, and their expressions changed drastically at the sight of Bloom's lifeless body. Lear quickly calmed down, and he looked at Bloom's corpse with a grave expression as he said, "Put out the fire first and seal this place. Don't tell anyone about this. I'll go into the palace to report this to His Majesty right away." Yes, all of the guards were in a panic, but they hurriedly responded and began to put out the fire to prevent it from spreading. During this period of time, the news of the Ministry of War's massacre had already spread throughout Rodu, and they didn't think that they would encounter it today. Thankfully, Sir Lear was here, so they were able to survive. Lear watched as the guards covered Bloom's corpse with a bedsheet before hurriedly leaving for the palace. There were watertight magic casters among the guards, and the fire that hadn't spread was quickly brought under control. "Did you hear anything just now?" "I think I heard Lord Bloom call out Josh at the end." "I heard that too, and I also heard Sir Lear call out Josh." "Could it be that Josh was the one who did this?" The guards discussed in low voices, and their expressions gradually became more and more horrified. "Silence. This matter is not to be spread, or your heads will be chopped off," a middle-aged guard yelled coldly. The guards' faces turned cold, and they didn't dare to say another word. The fire in General Bloom's residence wasn't a small matter, and the surrounding residents saw it clearly. Thinking of the tragedy that happened in the past few days, they couldn't help but feel anxious. "Scared to death?" Meg asked Irina as he watched the flames gradually extinguish. "More or less. He fainted from fright. Then I used a vampire bat to suck his essence blood dry." "It's about the same as the corpse you saw last time." Irina nodded. She then looked at Meg's tattered clothes. "You were injured by him?" "I did on purpose. Otherwise, how could I inadvertently let him see my true appearance?" Meg still had to wear Joshua's mask. He smiled as he reached out to take off his mask. "Now, let's see how Andre plans to deal with this." Irina smiled. "I'm using Joshua's method to frame him. I'm sure he'll be happy to hear that." Bloom's residence was on fire, and the nearby powerhouses quickly gathered. There was no lack of 10th-tier knights and mages among them. When they arrived at the residence, they were all shocked to know that Bloom was dead. When they saw Bloom's corpse, their expressions changed drastically. Such a tragic death couldn't help but remind them of the demon that had been causing panic recently. Under the questioning of the few powerhouses, the matter of Bloom crying out for Joshua before his death was also asked. The 10th-tier knights and great mages looked at each other and saw the fear and horror in each other's eyes. They didn't dare to ask any more questions. During this period of time, the Ministry of War was extremely turbulent because of the war. There were rumors that His Highness Joshua stole His Majesty's Commander Seal and started a war against the orcs and elves on his own. The more they knew, the more they were in awe and fear. If Joshua was the one who killed General Bloom, then the massacre of the other ministers of the Ministry of War was probably related to him as well. Murder and arson, the methods were the same. If it weren't for Lear's protection today, the general's residence would have been burned to the ground. Moreover, there are almost no complete corpses left behind in the previous massacres. Today, Lear braved death to carry Bloom's corpse out, but it was so tragic. It was inevitable that people would associate it with the demon. There's another fire. Could it be that someone committed the crime again? Lewis stood on the roof of a tall building and looked at the burning house in the distance. There are fluctuations from a battle between powerhouses. Let's go take a look. Douglas appeared beside him and looked in the direction of the fire with a solemn expression. He took a step and appeared 100 meters away. "Wait for me." Lewis hurriedly followed. The fire at the general's residence made the situation in Rodu very tense. Meanwhile, the couple who committed the murder and arson brought their 2 children home to eat hot pot. "Come, try the duck intestine that I just cooked. The beef is ready too. Help yourself." Meg smiled gently and said in a kind tone, just like a loving father and husband. Amy's bowl was full of food. She buried her head in it and couldn't stop eating. Irina chatted with Meg from time to time and helped into the food. She was also relaxed and happy. "Are you full? Do you want another mutton roll?" Meg asked with a smile as he looked at Amy, who finally finished all the food in her bowl. "No, Mother said that I have to eat less before going to bed at night. Otherwise, I will become a little fat girl." Amy put down her chopsticks and shook her head obediently. "Okay then." Meg nodded with a smile. Amy really knew how to control herself tonight. She only ate the food of 3 adults. The 2 children couldn't sleep after supper, so they played with Ugly Duckling on the first floor. Meg went to the kitchen to continue studying the recipe and cooking method of green bean cake. He had already mastered the cooking methods of many delicacies, but he didn't have any good desserts. Green bean cake was a good direction for a breakthrough. Moreover, He was also very curious about the mysterious reward from the system. Could it be the recipe for more desserts? The two little fellows liked snacks. If he could make more delicious desserts for them, they would definitely like it. 1 serving of green bean cake with uneven sugar content. 1 serving of green bean cake with a rough texture. 1 serving of green bean cake that is too sticky. The remarks given by the system allowed Meg to accurately understand the problem with this green bean cake and make precise adjustments. Father, I'm so sleepy. Can I go to sleep now? Amy rubbed her sleepy eyes and poked her little head out of the door. 1 serving of green bean cake up to standard. Ding! Congratulations on completing the mission of green bean cake improvement. You have received the title of Elementary Dessert Master. You have also received a dessert gift pack. Please check and accept. Almost at the same time, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Chapter 2018. After coaxing the 2 children asleep, Meg returned to his room and began to check the mission rewards issued to him by the system. He didn't care about the title of Junior Dessert Master. Anyway, only he could see it. What he cared more about was what was in the dessert gift bag. Opening the gift bag, 5 experience bags immediately jumped out. Mung bean cake, red bean cake, double skim milk, mango pancake, and egg yolk puff. Oh, it's really a big gift bag. Meg's eyes lit up. It was the first time for him to get 5 recipes at once. It was rare for the system to be so generous. He felt that desserts such as mung bean cake and red bean cake were ordinary, but egg yolk puff was his favorite. He didn't expect the system to put 1 in the gift bag. Perfect, quite perfect. Meg nodded with satisfaction and ordered the recipe of mung bean cake first. A complete and detailed recipe, as well as the exclusive experience and skills of pastry masters, poured into his mind in an instant. There is still a big gap between qualified and perfect. This time, the system is rare to be tolerant. Meg opened his eyes and said to himself. The more he understood, the more he was in awe. After gaining the experience of the masters, Meg immediately found that the mung bean cake he thought was perfect could only be regarded as a rough, defective product. However, with his own painstaking experience, it will be much easier to get started, so he didn't rush to enter the test field for the god of cookery. Instead, he opened the experience bag of egg yolk puff. This is too difficult. After a long time, Meg opened his eyes, and his eyes were still in a trance. If the difficulty of mung bean cake is 1, then the difficulty of egg yolk puff should be 5. Whether it is the number of ingredients, the complexity of the process, or the various skills, they all make Meg a little scared. After all, he is still a fairly new dessert master, not even a beginner. He has already expected the difficulties he will face. Come on, accept the challenge. Meg lay down, closed his eyes, and pushed open the door of the test field for the god of cookery. This is destined to be a long night for Meg. The next day, Meg opened his eyes and met 4 pairs of eyes. You're awake. Irina looked at him with a smile. The sun is shining on your butt, Amy said with a smile. Meg still hadn't recovered from the nightmare of the yolk puff. He blinked his eyes and glanced at the alarm clock on the bedside. It's 11 o'clock. Meg was slightly surprised. It was not just the sun shining on his butt. It was already noon. I think I overslept. Meg sat up and put Ugly Duckling, which was sleeping on his arm, aside awkwardly. It's not just a little. I can't wake you up no matter what. I almost wanted to treat you. Irina curled her lips. Maybe he's too tired. Meg looked left and right. In the test field for the god of cookery, his perception of the outside world was sealed. If the system did not sense any threat, it would not alert him. Therefore, he did not hear Irina's call at all. You must be hungry. I'll make breakfast, lunch for you. Meg got up from the bed. We already had breakfast. You still have a lot of green bean cakes left from last night, and there's milk in the fridge. Amy touched her stomach. But we're hungry again now. Let's go downstairs. After lunch, I'll make new desserts for you. Meg smiled and patted Amy's head. New desserts? I had a good sleep and had a good dream. I learned it in my dream. Meg nodded. Are you serious? You can learn to cook in your dream? Irina looked at Meg doubtfully. If you don't believe me, you'll know in a while. Also, I've improved the green bean cakes. Today, I'll let you try what a real green bean cake is. Meg went out confidently. After lunch, Meg rested for a while and went into the kitchen to fiddle with the green bean cakes and egg yolk pastries. After learning them, the system gave him a brand new mold and cooking tools, as well as a special oven. The green bean cakes were relatively simple, but the preparation was more tedious. Fortunately, he had soaked some green beans in the fridge last night. He could directly peel them and start making the green bean cakes, saving him a lot of waiting time. The egg yolk pastries, on the other hand, were much more complicated. Irina stood at the kitchen door and watched Meg take out ingredients and condiments from a fridge. She asked curiously, "When did you buy these things? I didn't see you buy them when I went shopping yesterday." Meg's hand stiffened slightly. After so long, she was finally suspicious of the inexhaustible ingredients that appeared in the fridge out of nowhere. "Oh, I know. You must have bought them when you went to buy the green bean pastries." Just as Meg was thinking about how to explain, Irina had already found a perfect excuse for him. "Yes, that's how it is." Meg nodded. The complexity of the egg yolk pastries lay in their four-layer structure. The outermost layer was the oily skin, which was the attractive layer of pastry. The oily skin was wrapped in the pastry, and the layers were repeatedly rolled out with a rolling pin. Then, the salted egg yolk was wrapped in red bean paste and pressed into the oily skin and pastry. The surface was brushed with a layer of egg yolk and sprinkled with a small pinch of black sesame seeds. Only then could the pastry be put into the oven. The baking process was also particular about 3 brushes and 3 roasts. The baking of the egg yolk pastries was not done in one go. The egg yolk pastries had to be brushed 3 times, which meant that they had to be baked 3 times before the golden and crispy egg yolk pastries could be officially baked. The whole process was like an artistic performance. The 2 children had come to the door of the restaurant at some point and were watching Meg's performance with rapt attention. "Father is really amazing." Amy's mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were full of admiration. Anne's expression was similar, and her eyes were also full of admiration as she looked at Meg. Irina leaned against the door frame and looked at Meg with great interest. She didn't know why, but when Meg put down the long sword and picked up the kitchen knife and stayed in the small kitchen to cook quietly, she felt at ease and that she could rely on him. She was like a rootless duckweed that had suddenly found a harbor to dock at. Ding! The oven made a notification sound. Meg turned off the oven's power and opened the oven door. "It smells so good." A milky aroma, mixed with the aroma of egg yolk pastries, immediately filled the kitchen and rushed toward the kitchen door. The eyes of the 3 people who were waiting at the kitchen door lit up. Meg took out a plate of egg yolk pastries from the oven under the watchful eyes of the 3 people. They were golden in color and had a trace of oily sheen on the surface. The top was dotted with sesame seeds and looked extremely tempting. "This is the egg yolk pastries, but you have to cool them for a while before you can eat them." Meg walked out with the plate of egg yolk pastries with a smile. Chapter 2019. Irina, Amy, and then sat around the dining table and stared at the plate of egg yolk puffs in the middle of the table. The aroma of egg yolk puffs wafted over, along with a hint of milk. The 3 of them couldn't help but swallow their saliva. "Father, when can we eat egg yolk puffs?" Amy tilted her head and looked at Meg, who was standing at the side, and asked expectantly, "We still have to wait a little longer. They'll taste better when they're cold." Meg knew that the little girl was getting impatient, but in order to let the egg yolk puffs taste the best, the wait was worth it. "We just have to let them cool down, right?" Irina asked Meg. "Yes." "Then I have an idea." Irina turned around and entered the kitchen. After a while, Irina came out with a box that was carved out of ice. The top of the box was open, and there was a simple waterproof layer made of chopsticks at the bottom. Then, she placed a shallow plate on top of the box. Irina used chopsticks to pick up a few egg yolk puffs and put them into the icebox. Hot air and cold air intertwined, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Naturally, there was no problem with physical cooling. Meg didn't stop her. Not long after, Amy tiptoed and poked the egg yolk puffs in the icebox with her little finger. She said in surprise, "They're already cold." Meg poked the egg yolk puff with his chopsticks. It had indeed hardened. He nodded and said, "Then they're ready to eat." "Father, have one first." Amy reached out and grabbed a yolk puff puff and handed it to Meg. Amy, eat first. I'll eat later. No, Father worked so hard. The first egg yolk puff puff must be eaten by Father. Amy shook her head firmly. Okay, I'll eat it too. Meg took the egg yolk puff puff. His heart felt warm. His little girl was still the most considerate. Hee hee. A smile appeared on Amy's face. She gave Irina another egg yolk pastry each. Then, she grabbed the last egg yolk pastry and took a big bite. Ugh, it's delicious. Super satisfied. The slightly crispy skin was wrapped in a soft pastry, and the layers of crispy texture spread in the mouth with a light bite. His teeth easily tore open the egg yolk wrapped in bean paste. The wonderful texture and taste made the little guy unable to help but start to shake left and right. His two legs that could not reach the ground swayed gently, and his little face was full of satisfaction. Is it really that delicious? Irina looked at Amy, who was immersed in the yolk puff, and also took a bite of the yolk puff in her hand. Irina's eyes were filled with disbelief. Under the crispy skin, there was a dense and sweet red bean paste, and the innermost part was the oily and salty egg yolk. Crispness, softness, sweetness, and saltiness filled his mouth. How could one mouthful be enough? One mouthful after another. The small egg yolk puff entered his stomach in no time. She licked a bit of the crispy skin on her fingertips and licked her lips. She looked at Meg and nodded with satisfaction. Not bad, delicious. Oh, it should not be said that it was not just delicious. It was extremely delicious. Irina had never eaten such a delicious dessert in her life. Whether it was the wonderful combination of the layers or the heavenly horse, starry sky, wrapped in the salty egg yolk, it was amazing and addictive. Compared to the green bean cake, this egg yolk puff had successfully been promoted to the #1 dessert in her heart, and took small bites of the egg yolk puff. From the smile on her face and the look of surprise on her face, she was also very satisfied with this egg yolk puff. Meg's lips curled up slightly, and his heart was filled with joy. As a chef, the greatest sense of accomplishment was to be highly recognized by others for the food that he had worked hard to make. Moreover, it was the people closest to him that he cared about the most. Suddenly, he felt that the continuous competition with the egg yolk puff for 10 days in the test field for the god of cookery was very worth it. Meg took a bite of the egg yolk puff in his hand. The egg yolk puff that was made with the utmost care and ingenuity was indeed delicious to the point that it made a fierce man cry. Even the egg yolk puffs that he had eaten before in front of this egg yolk puff could only be considered small fry. So, the tavern is going to sell desserts next? Irina took a few more egg yolk puffs and placed them in the icebox to cool down as she casually asked. No, the Saipan Tavern is not worthy. Meg shook his head and smiled. This egg yolk puff will be left for the customers of Mamie's. Treat it as a little compensation for the time that I took off. All right, you didn't cook for the grandfather and grandson pair in the morning, and you didn't deliver lunch to them in the afternoon. Irina reminded. Oh, I forgot all about that. Meg slapped his head. Indeed, it was good to wake up late and delay everything. He went into the kitchen and made a portion of braised chicken and rice for Melanie and Noah. After packing it, Meg packed 2 egg yolk puffs for them and placed them in the teleportation array to be teleported to them. Grandpa, did Mr. Mac forget about us? Noah looked at the simple teleportation array in the corner of the room and swallowed his saliva. As a member of the Ghost Clan, don't just think about talking. You're useless. Melanie scolded. He couldn't help but look at the corner of the room, and his stomach failed to live up to his expectations and growled. The past 2 days were probably the most comfortable days for the grandfather and grandson pair. They didn't have to wander around, and their meals were all extremely delicious. However, breakfast and lunch weren't delivered on time today, and they were a little unused to it. At that moment, a golden light flashed in the corner, and a food box appeared in the corner. It's here! Noah jumped up from the bed in surprise and rushed to the front to pick up the food box. He placed it on the small table beside him and opened it with a sincere expression. The thick smell of chicken soup filled the room. Oh, such a tempting smell, as expected of Mr. Mac. Noah took a deep breath and brought out 2 extra portions of braised chicken and rice. But what are these two? Noah took out 2 egg yolk puffs from the top shelf. It smells like eggs. Maybe some kind of bird's egg is cooked. Melanie picked up 1 egg yolk puff and took a sniff. He even took a bite as he spoke. The crispy skin was shockingly delicious. The crispness of the skin, the sweetness of the red bean filling, the saltiness of the salted egg yolk, all kinds of flavors were released in the mouth and then intertwined with each other to create an incredible taste. Rip! Melante's shirt burst open, revealing his firm chest. Is it that bad? Promise glanced at Melante's torn shirt and put the other egg yolk puff into her mouth. Bookhouse reading website. Chapter 2020. This texture, this taste, how can it be so delicious? Noah's eyes widened, and tears began to flow down his cheeks. This delicious feeling was simply too touching. This was a delicacy that could make an old man in his 70s shed tears and tear his clothes. Was this human nature? You're a man, yet you're crying over a little dessert, Melander said with a disdainful expression. Noah sniffed and reminded, Then pull up your clothes, Grandpa. Be mindful of your image. The small egg yolk pastry was quickly eaten by the two of them. The two of them looked at each other and could see the dissatisfaction in each other's eyes. If it weren't for the fact that it was inconvenient for them to go out, they wouldn't have bothered to ask Mr. Mack to make them another egg yolk pastry. Come, let's eat. Noah brought out the braised chicken and sat down to eat. Perhaps it was because he had been starving for 2 meals, but the braised chicken was particularly delicious today. Even the rice was becoming more and more fragrant as he chewed. News of the fire at the general's residence and the assassination attempt on General Bloom had already spread throughout Rodu, and it had become a hot topic of discussion. Connecting the dots to the massacre of several high-ranking officials from the Ministry of War 2 days ago, all of the officials of the royal court were in grave danger, and even the commoners were in a state of panic. Furthermore, there were rumors that General Bloom had called out the name of the second prince, Josh, before his death, and the 10th tier knight in charge of protecting him, Leal, had also mentioned Josh. There were also rumors that Josh had issued the order to attack the orcs and elves behind the king's back, and that he had destroyed the families of several high-ranking officials from the Ministry of War in a fit of rage. Of course, this kind of news couldn't be spread openly, but due to the fact that it was quite sensational and reasonable, it began to spread uncontrollably. Of course, news of General Bloom's horrific death also began to spread. Some people said that he had encountered a ghost, while others said that Josh was the devil. Regardless of which piece of news it was, they were both horrifying and nerve-wracking. The fact that Josh hadn't been to court during this period of time also indirectly confirmed the authenticity of this piece of news. In the royal study in the royal palace, Bastard, Andre swept a tall stack of memorials to the ground as he yelled with rage. The ministers in the imperial study lowered their heads in fear and trepidation, not daring to speak. Lear stood in the corner, his head lowered nervously. He had entered the palace the previous night to report this matter to His Majesty, upon which His Majesty was enraged. He ordered a dozen or so 10th-tier powerful beings to search the entire Rodu several times, but unfortunately, they were unable to find any suspects. Your Majesty, this matter has not been thoroughly investigated, but there are already rumors circulating among the people that His Highness Joshua has become a puppet of the devil and killed the entire family of the court officials. I believe that we should control the spread of such rumors, Richard said with a bow. Andre's gaze fell on Richard, his gaze sharp. Sweat began to bead on Richard's forehead. Then go and find Joshua. Have him explain himself to me personally, Andre said with an ice-cold voice. Your humble servant does not know where His Highness Joshua is right now. Richard's voice was trembling slightly. Then how can you guarantee that he is innocent? Lear saw it with his own eyes. Bloom screamed his name before he died. Did you see his body? If he hadn't seen something so terrifying, would a general who had experienced hundreds of battles be scared to death? Would all the blood in his body have been sucked dry? Andre's voice had become very sharp. Richard immediately knelt onto the ground as beads of sweat began to flow from his forehead. Find him for me, but I don't want to hear any news about this anywhere else, Andre said coldly. Yes, All of the officials replied in unison, and a few of them hurriedly departed. Everyone else, take your leave. Lear, stay behind, Andre said. All of the officials departed, leaving only Lear behind. Are you sure that the person you saw yesterday was Joshua? Andre asked. Yes. Even though he was wearing a black robe, I injured him during our battle and just so happened to see his face. I can confirm that it was His Highness Joshua. Lear nodded in response. He's a magic caster and has never learned swordsmanship before. Andre's brows furrowed. His movement techniques were very strange, and he didn't engage in a direct battle with me. However, he was most likely no less powerful than a 9th-tier magic caster. Also, he gave off an unsettling aura that made me fearful as soon as I got close to him. Lear recalled the battle with the black-robed man last night, and he still felt a chill down his spine. Andre nodded slightly. After a moment of silence, he waved his hand and said, "You may leave." "Yes," Lear replied, and hurriedly left the royal study. Andre sat down slowly. After a long silence, he looked at a corner and said, "What do you think about this matter?" "Your Majesty," Lear didn't lie. "Bloom's corpse is indeed strange. I went to investigate the scene last night, and indeed found a sinister demonic aura. Even though I can't confirm that it was done by His Highness the Second Prince, I'm afraid it has something to do with the devil." A black figure slowly appeared from the corner and said in a hoarse voice, "Find him and bring him back to see me," Andre said. "Yes. What do we do now? It seems like Josh has really become the devil's puppet. He even killed Bloom. I'm afraid he will kill more people, start a war, and absorb more resentment," Lewis said as he leaned against the window and looked at Douglas, who was sitting at the table. Seems like Andre doesn't want others to know about this. Even though he was set up by his son, he still bore all the responsibility silently after he came back, Douglas said coldly. "But we can't let him off just like that. If even he is controlled by the devil, there will be no more peace on the Norland continent. So, he wants to cover up his ugliness, so we'll rip off his underwear." "Wow, are you such a pervert? What's wrong with men being perverted?" "Very well. I like it. But what are we going to do? If he doesn't want others to know about this, then we'll let everyone on the Norland continent know about it. We'll make Josh a target of scorn. Find him and kill him," Douglas said coldly. "I'm going out to get a letter," Meg said to Irina, and went out. The Great Temple had an office in Rodu. As an internal member with very high authority, Meg was already connected to the office on the first day he came to Chaos City and received the latest intelligence every day. This was much more convenient and accurate than him going out to search and purchase. Perhaps even Michael hadn't received such first-hand information yet. Chapter 2021. Meg had obtained today's secret report from the secret tree hole, and after some slight modifications and embellishments, he used the 100 transformation mask to change his face. He sold this latest intelligence report to a few paid intelligence agencies in Rodu, and at the same time, he gave a free copy to all of the storytellers in the tea houses. In less than an afternoon, the second prince, Josh, had sold his soul to the devil, waged war against the outside world, and murdered his ministers and their families. His crimes were unpardonable, and His Majesty had already issued an order to depose him from his position as a prince. Thus, news of him being arrested and apologized to all of the people who had died tragically spread throughout Rodu. Such explosive news sent shockwaves through the entire royal court. On the other hand, this news signified that the battle for the throne that had been going on for over a decade had most likely already come to an end. Josh had chosen to sell his soul to the devil, which meant that he had been eliminated from the battle for the throne, and First Prince Sean would become the only successor to the throne. Within the First Prince's manor, Josh, that idiot, was eliminated by himself in the end. What a waste of effort. Sean looked at the intelligence report he had just received with a smug smile on his face. He was undoubtedly the one who had benefited the most from this incident. Initially, he was still grieving over Bloom's death. After all, Bloom was his greatest ally, but he had suddenly died. However, judging from the current situation, his death was very worthwhile. He had taken Josh down into the abyss with him, and he would never be able to rise again. Your Highness, the royal palace hasn't released any information on this yet, so we'll have to treat this report with caution, one of his subordinates reminded. A smile appeared on Sean's face, and he said, as long as this news is spread, then it's the truth. From this day forth, Josh is dead. Abraham listened to the butler's report, and he was so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth for a long time. Master, should I prepare a carriage for you to enter the palace? The butler asked in a quiet voice. Abraham pondered in silence for a moment before shaking his head. There's no need for that. His Majesty didn't summon me into the palace, nor did he officially announce this to the world. This is most likely just a rumor. Pass down my order that no one in the Duke's manor is allowed to discuss this matter. Anyone who disobeys my orders will be expelled immediately. The butler left with his orders, and Abraham began to pace around the hall with a troubled expression. That shouldn't be the case. No matter how you look at it, Josh still had a 50% chance of winning this battle. Why would he do something so stupid before His Majesty made a decision? If Vanessa knew about this, she would definitely die. Sigh. Youngsters nowadays, I really don't understand them. Seems like we're not the only ones keeping an eye on this, Douglas said in surprise as he looked at the information in his hand. Douglas was very Douglas's Douglas. Joshua and Sean and Lord's actions is Douglas and His Majesty and their methods, most likely and his, and SS, their plan. Josh to the done so. Fire Bloom, S's was done so, and all twos, SS news. Woods, and nothing, but this had to. Without doing anything, the news, and the news to be spread of. Since the fire has already started, let's create another storm. Douglas smirked. Not long after, an open letter in the name of the giant dragons was sent to the Rodu royal palace and spread across the Norland continent. In this letter, the giant dragons condemned Andre for harboring Josh, who was controlled by the devil, and for colluding with the devil. He allowed Josh to start a war against the orcs and elves, and for wantonly killing the officials and their innocent family members in Rodu, and for trying to start a new racial war. Furthermore, in this letter, the giant dragons even gave Andre an ultimatum. They requested Andre to capture Josh as soon as possible so that he could give everyone an explanation. If the rumors circulating in the day were said to have limited influence, then this open letter from the giant dragons was like a heavy bomb that tore apart all pretense. The second prince had turned into a devil and was wantonly massacring people in Rodu. The people's hearts were in turmoil. This assist is so professional. Meg looked at the open letter he had just received and was a little surprised. This attack was tantamount to announcing Josh's social death. No matter how he tried to clear his name in the future, with such a stain, unless he controlled everyone, he would never be able to become the king of the Roth Empire again. He could already imagine how furious Andre or Josh would be when they received this news. We started the show, and the show went on by itself. The effect is better than we expected, Irina said with a smile as she looked at the letter in Meg's hand. The devil made the Norland continent feel threatened, and, as the second prince of the Roth Empire, Josh sold his soul to the devil. Now, public opinion would force Andre to investigate this matter thoroughly and cut off all ties with Josh. It was foreseeable that an anti-Johnson alliance would be formed soon. Andre had completely lost the legitimacy and initiative to start a war. He might even have to consider how to prove that the Edward royal family had not completely fallen and become the devil's servant. Not bad. Meg kept the open letter in his hand. He looked at Irina with a smile and said, I'm in a good mood today, so let's have a good meal. You can order whatever you want to eat. I want to eat yolk cake, roast meat, roast pig's eyes, roast fish. Amy popped her head out from behind the counter and was the first to say her name. Then let's have a barbecue feast. I'll go and prepare. Meg walked to the kitchen with a smile. It felt so good to give someone a taste of their own medicine. You lied to me. Things are not like what you said at all. I have nothing now. Outside Rodu, In a dark cave, a furious voice reverberated in the empty cave. The faint light cast an illusionary shadow of the black-robed figure on the wall. The shadow slowly squirmed, and many tentacles sprouted from its body. There are no issues with the implementation of the plan, and the war has already begun. You've gained your current power through that resentment, but there are some bad guys who ruined our plan. You have to find them and kill them, and I'll help you. Everything in this world will be yours, and everyone will submit to you. A hoarse voice sounded within the cave, and the black shadow also began to sway slightly. Kill them? Ha! Josh chuckled in despair. They just want to lure me out to kill me. So how am I supposed to kill them? Even you were resealed by Alex. I have nothing now, and you're the culprit behind all of this. I shouldn't have trusted you. I shouldn't have trusted you. Who else can you trust aside from me? Relax. Everything has only just begun. The shadow's voice gradually became gentler. All of a sudden, the shadow on the wall pounced toward Josh, and it transformed into wisps of black mist that flowed into his body. The shadow on the wall swayed, and a series of tentacles could be seen burrowing into Josh's head before completely disappearing. Now, I am you, and you are me. Chapter 2022. As night fell, Romo Street was as desolate as ever. Occasionally, there were nostalgic guests who came to look around, but looking at the withered long street and the rare restaurants and taverns, they didn't have much impulse to go into the shops. This situation had lasted for a year, and the remaining businesses had begun to consider the issue of closing. They would starve to death if they relied on love to generate electricity. Sir Lucian, it seems that there are not many taverns left on Romo Street, except for the Titan Tavern, but they are too noisy. Let's change places. Several officials of the Ministry of War followed Lucian as they walked on Romo Street. An official said, "Yeah, I haven't been here for a year. I didn't expect it to be so desolate. No matter what, it was the first choice for eating, drinking, and playing around in the past." There were also officials who said with some emotion, "I'll take you to a good place. Except for Romo Street, you can't find a second place anywhere else." Lucian said with a smile. The officials were a little surprised when they heard the words. Sir Lucian called several of their colleagues from the Ministry of War out to drink today. Recently, major events had happened one after another. They had nothing to do now, and they were in a bad mood. Naturally, they would gladly go to the appointment. Speaking of it, Bobby brought me to this place. Lucian looked at Bobby standing at the edge, and said, "It turned out to be a place recommended by Sir Bobby. There must be good wine." The officials were thoughtful. At the same time, they kept their thoughts. Everyone in the Ministry of War knew that Hector and Bobby were close friends. They often drank together on weekdays. The relationship between Lucian and Hector was also quite close. Now that Hector was gone, Lucian and Bobby were quite close. Today, several officials of the Ministry of War came out to drink together. With Bobby's official position and identity, he was generally not invited, but he was brought by Lucian. It was inevitable that people would think a little more. The day before yesterday, I happened to come across this newly opened tavern and tasted the good wine, so I dared to bring you to taste it. Bobby quickly said humbly. His official position was the lowest here. This time, Lucian brought him here, probably with the intention of guiding him. He naturally had to perform well. Not long after, the group arrived at the door of Saipan Tavern. The ministers were surprised that a new tavern had opened here, but since Lucian had brought them here, they naturally did not say much and followed him into the tavern. This was a new tavern, but the furnishings and decorations were very simple and did not appear luxurious at all. It was very different from the taverns they usually frequented. However, after what had happened in the past few days, they really had no intention of going to the tavern to drink and have fun. They just wanted to find a quiet place to drink, chat, and relieve the depression in their hearts. "Oh, we have customers again," Amy said as she poked her head out from behind the counter and looked curiously at the group of people who had just entered. "Wow, what a cute little girl." Everyone's eyes lit up as they looked at the little guy who looked like he was carved out of jade. They couldn't help but smile. "Hello, everyone." Amy greeted them with a smile, looking obedient and cute. "Hello, young lady. Lucian said with a smile. He had a very good impression of this tavern, and he had enjoyed himself to the fullest last night. After returning home, he had a rare good night's sleep. He felt refreshed when he woke up this morning. If it wasn't for the news of Bloom being killed, he would feel that it was a very good day. Meg came out of the kitchen when he heard the sound. He glanced at Bobby, and the corner of his mouth raised slightly. This person is simply the bartender of the tavern. He brings people to drink every 2 or 3 days, and the scale is getting bigger and bigger. He really does his best. What would you like to drink? Meg asked in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. He was not intimidated by the official robes and official aura of this group of people. Lucian glanced at the 8 of them who came this time. He thought for a moment and said, "Give me 3 bottles of Mount Eye wine and a bottle of whiskey to try. Give me 2 servings of each side dish. By the way, give me 2 more servings of Drunkard's peanuts." "Okay, please wait a moment." Meg nodded and turned into the kitchen. This boss is interesting. When we want to eat and drink in the past, those bosses were all flattering and fawning on us. He is not in a hurry at all, a minister said with a smile. Yeah, this boss looks very young. Can he really brew good wine? There were also ministers who were puzzled. Maybe it's his personality, but the wine brewed by this boss is indeed good wine. Bobby explained with a smile. Everyone chose a seat inside and sat down. As they chatted, they talked about the assassination of Bloom. Seeing that there was no one in the tavern, only a little girl playing behind the wine cabinet, and the boss was also busy in the kitchen, they avoided the important matters and focused on the trivial matters. Bloom was a military general, but he did not hold a position in the Ministry of War. He was estranged from the officials, so his death was far less impactful than the death of several ministers in the Ministry of War and the extermination of their family. However, other news brought out by this assassination incident made them fearful and fearful. If the person who killed Bloom was really the second prince, Joshua, then the murderer who slaughtered their colleagues' families was most likely Joshua too. Those ministers had their families massacred because Joshua was imprisoned before they could clear their names. As a result, several of them could not bear it and committed suicide in the prison. Lucian was in a high position, and this matter was very sensitive. After just a few words, Lucian changed the topic. Your wine and dishes, please enjoy. Meg quickly served the wine and dishes to everyone, and then tactfully retreated. What kind of style is this? It's quite unique. Looking at the 3 round Moutai bottles and the whiskey in the slender crystal bottle, everyone's eyes lit up. With everyone's status, they naturally drank a lot of good wine, but there were not many taverns that would spend so much effort on the bottles. This is Moutai, the most delicious wine I have ever tasted. Bobby picked up a bottle of Moutai and skillfully opened the cap. A thick aroma of wine instantly wafted out. This aroma, the minister's eyes lit up, and those who loved wine couldn't help but take a deep breath of the wine. Just by smelling the aroma, I know it's a rare good wine. I didn't expect that there would be such a good wine hidden in a newly opened tavern on Romo Street. A minister exclaimed. Bobby took a few glasses and filled them up for each minister one by one. I'm not drinking Moutai today. I want to try this so-called whiskey. Lucian refused Bobby's offer to pour him wine and picked up the bottle of whiskey on the table instead. Such a crystal bottle was rare. Even if it was sold separately, it could be sold at a good price for Meg. However, the boss used it to store wine. It was worth 2,000 copper coins for a bottle of wine. This crystal bottle alone was definitely worth it. Let me open the bottle for you. Meg came at the right time and took the whiskey from Lucian's hand. He first removed the cap and then pulled out the cork with the bottle opener. Please enjoy. Meg put down the whiskey. Chapter 2023. The cork of the bottle was opened, and the aroma of wine slowly drifted out. Lucian, who was originally looking forward to it, slowly frowned. He picked up the bottle and poured himself a glass. He put the glass in front of his nose and sniffed it. Then he looked at Meg and said, "Boss, is your wine burnt?" "Yeah, there's a smell of smoke." A person next to him also nodded. Although it wasn't bad, it was a smell that shouldn't appear in wine. Several ministers' faces suddenly pulled down. They came out to drink, and no one dared to fool them with bad things. This boss was not kind. Bobby looked at Meg. He had a good impression of the boss, but if there was a problem with the wine, he really had to explain it clearly. This is not burnt. It is the unique burnt aroma and smoke smell of whiskey. Without this smoke smell, it would lose its soul. Meg explained slowly, of course, some people will like this smell, and some people can't accept it, but this has nothing to do with being burnt. Aren't you fooling us? A minister frowned, and his official prestige was revealed. He was faintly angry. Whiskey and Moutai are made by ingenuity in my heart. How can I fool you? Why don't you taste it yourself? If you don't like it, just don't drink it. Meg was neither servile nor overbearing. Lucian raised his hand slightly and motioned to the accompanying officials not to be angry. He looked at Meg and smiled. I believe that the person who can brew such a good wine as Moutai will not lie. I will try the taste of this wine first and see if it suits my taste. As Lucian spoke, he picked up the glass and took a sip of whiskey. His brows frowned first, then his eyebrows raised slightly, showing a bit of surprise. Then his frowning brows gradually eased, and finally he showed a smile. When the wine entered his mouth, it tasted dry and mellow, and a faint smoky taste drifted in his mouth, bringing a trace of a psychedelic feeling. The faint charred fragrance wasn't pungent or unpleasant, but instead added a layer to the wine's fragrance. This was a different feeling from the pure and extreme aroma of Moutai. He was so unique, but he maintained an amazing high standard. He was also an outstanding wine. The wine swirled in his mouth and slid down his throat. The fragrance lingered in his mouth for a long time. Lucian knew that he had fallen in love with this bottle of whiskey. It was so special and so surprising. Only after tasting it could he know the wonderful taste hidden under the deceptive fragrance. Good wine. What a good wine. Lucian slowly opened his eyes and looked at Meg apologetically. Boss, we were too reckless. This is a fine wine that can be compared to Moutai. Please enjoy. Meg nodded slightly and turned to leave. This time, it was Bobby and the others' turn to be surprised. Sir Meg, is this wine really that good? The minister who had previously scolded Meg asked in disbelief. You will know after you have a glass. Lucian smiled and picked up the empty glass beside him and poured a glass for him. Okay, since Sir said it is good, then I will also try a glass. The minister took a sip of the wine glass. He also frowned, and then his eyes lit up. He looked down at the wine glass in his hand in surprise, and then looked at Lucian. He swallowed the wine and savored the aftertaste. Then he nodded in admiration and said, It is really a good wine. I didn't expect such a fine wine to be hidden in this small tavern. Didn't Lord Cat-Ora say that the wine was a joke? Lucian joked. Cat-Ola smiled awkwardly and said in the direction of the wine cabinet, Boss, don't mind me. I'm a straightforward person. Your wine is indeed a good wine. It's okay, as long as the customer is satisfied. Meg responded, Do you want to try it? Lucian looked at the other ministers and asked, I am already craving for this Moutai wine. I am afraid this wine is more to my taste. Let's try this first. Yes, I have never smelled such a fragrant wine. I have already poured it. Let's try this first. The others showed greater interest in the Moutai wine in front of them. Okay, the wine and dishes have been served. Let's not be restrained. Let's drink. Lucian picked up the wine glass and reminded them with a smile. Let me remind you that this wine is amazing. It is very strong. Drink it slowly. Then, sounds of admiration sounded in the tavern. Whether it was the Moutai wine or the whiskey, they all brought great surprise to everyone. This table of people brought some of the liveliness that a tavern should have in a usually quiet tavern. Opening a tavern is indeed much easier than opening a restaurant. I have entered the wrong line of work. Meg sat behind the counter and watched the two little guys play checkers on the small bench while listening to the group of old men chatting. Reminder to the host, please increase the popularity of the tavern as soon as possible. Current popularity of the tavern, 8. Set a small goal of 1,000 popularity first. Do your best. Godfather, Daddy is very comfortable when you call me Daddy. Meg nodded. Daddy will work hard. TSK? TSK. Scram. The system roared. Mag ignored the system's roar and said, that's good. Look at how happy these people are chatting. After drinking a few glasses of wine, they dare to talk about anything. If other customers were here, they wouldn't dare to listen. Don't forget, you have bought half a street. The system reminded. Meg frowned and realized that things were not simple. This investment was going to be a huge loss. Whiskey and Maudai were both high-alcohol wines. For these people who usually drank fruit wine with low alcohol content, it was even more so. The first few glasses were drunk while they were in high spirits. After a few glasses and a few peanuts, they were stunned. Meg did not have any other hobbies recently. He liked to chat with the customers when they were drunk. For example, Bloom, who was killed by them last night, how the officials were feeling recently, and what they thought of Joshua. Even the Grey Temple's intelligence system could not collect such first-hand information. After calling the coachman of the officials to carry the drunk officials away, Meg flipped the wooden sign on the door and announced the end of business for the day. Joshua was finished. The smear was successful and the effect was obvious. Now, Joshua was no different from the devil in the eyes of the officials of the Ministry of War. They wanted to kill him as soon as possible to avenge the families of the innocent officials who died tragically. Moreover, they had decided that they would jointly write a letter tomorrow asking the king to investigate the matter and bring the murderer to justice. How promising! Meg generously waived the cost of a serving of peanuts for the drunkard. Chapter 2024. When you feel that life isn't going your way, don't panic. Just feel your empty wallet and cry. Meg said calmly to the middle-aged man sitting at the door of his tavern and looking at the lively Titan Tavern across the street. The man looked back at Meg with some bitterness. His mouth moved and his eyes glistened with tears. From his clothes, although he wasn't rich, he definitely wasn't a homeless person. However, one thing was for sure. He definitely didn't have enough money to buy a glass of wine, but he didn't want to go home. That was why he was sitting in front of a tavern and looking at another tavern. Their excitement has nothing to do with me, because I don't have money. If a man doesn't have money in his pocket, he just can't straighten his back. Meg sighed faintly. He took out a few gold coins from his pocket and tossed them in his hand. The man's expression became even more bitter. He glanced at the gold coins in Meg's hand and looked away angrily. Judging from his body size, he wasn't confident that he could snatch the gold coins from the cheap tavern owner. After a moment of silence, the man looked back at Meg. I have a story, you have wine. Sorry, I'm not interested. Meg shook his head slightly. Man, Pike __. However, since you're so interested in the tavern across the street, why don't you go sit at the door across the street? Meg asked curiously. There's so many people there. Do you think I don't care about my reputation? Also, it's quite warm here. The man glanced at him, still angry. Oh, I see. Meg thought for a moment and then felt offended. What? Do you think there's no one here? Also, there's a heater? It's quite cold outside today. Meg stomped his feet. Although the heater in the room made the door a little warmer, it couldn't withstand the bleak cold wind. Yes, it would be nice if there was a place to sit. The man rubbed his hands and nodded. He looked at Meg expectantly. The steps are quite flat. I'll leave a bigger gap for you. Meg smiled generously and opened the door a crack. Warm air blew out from the tavern. Thank you. The man nodded with difficulty. You're welcome. Meg waved his hand generously and turned to enter the tavern. Sigh, passed aside and tightened his little cotton-padded jacket. Men were too difficult. He was a long-distance carriage driver with more than 20 years of experience. He had been to many places as a long-distance transport driver for the trading company. However, he had just lost his job today. The boss said that there might be a war, and the trade route was blocked. He didn't know when it would be restored, so he told the coachman to go home. This month's salary could only be received in 2 days. Even if he received his salary from the boss, he had to give it to his wife immediately. Of course, he wasn't afraid of his wife. He just respected her. Yes, that was it. There were 3 children at home. They were all growing up. With his salary, he could barely make ends meet. After sitting for a while, Passa was ready to get up and go home. He had already thought about it. He would look for a job tomorrow. Even if he couldn't be a coachman, he could find other jobs. At least he couldn't let his wife and children starve. Have a drink. At this time, a familiar voice came from behind. Pasa turned around and looked at Meg, who was holding a small stool and a tray in his hand. Meg put the tray on the small stool. There was a plate of drunkard's peanuts and half a bottle of Maudai wine left by the group of people. Because there were too many people, Meg didn't know who to pack it for, so he could only dispose of it like this. Meg and Pasa sat on the steps across the small stool. The door behind them was completely open. The warm air blew from behind, blowing away the cold air. Pop! Meg uncorked the bottle and poured the wine into 2 glasses. Good wine. Pasa smelled the wine, and his eyes suddenly lit up. He didn't like wine, but all the coachmen would drink wine in winter to keep warm. After traveling for so many years, he had also drunk wine from all over the world, but he had never smelled such wine. Good taste. Meg poured 2 glasses of wine, reached out, and picked up a glass. He looked at Pasa and said, "Come on, let's toast to this bullshit life. To this bullshit life." Pasa also picked up his glass, gently touched it, and then drank it. This was a good wine that Pasa had never drunk in his life. When the wine entered his stomach, a warmth rose from the bottom of his heart. It came from a warmth brought by the wine, but also from a stranger who handed him a glass of wine in the cold wind. Drunkard's peanuts, try it. Meg picked up a peanut and threw it into his mouth, chewing it crisply. Pasa also picked up a peanut and put it into his mouth. He was surprised that these ordinary peanuts had become so crispy and spicy. He couldn't help but want another glass of wine. Meg filled his glass again, but this time he wasn't in a hurry to drink with him. This wasn't beer. If he drank 1 glass after another, half a bottle would be gone. Furthermore, if this guy was drunk, he didn't know what to do. I'm a coachman, and I've been to many places. The Twilight Forest, the Wind Forest, Chaos City. I've been to all of them, but I haven't been to the Demon Islands. I heard that demons eat people, and you have to take a boat, so I haven't been there. Pasa and Meg chatted, but he didn't talk about his sad life. Instead, he talked about what he had seen and heard during his years as a coachman on the Northern continent. Meg listened carefully most of the time. He was listening to a coachman's view of the world and the world. This was a very interesting experience. At least, he didn't have this kind of experience often in his life. He was looking at a normal person who was seriously living his life. Thank you for the wine. I'll come and drink with you again when I have money in my pocket. Next time, it's my treat. Pasa was a little tipsy, and he looked at Meg with a serious expression. All right, it's your treat next time. Meg nodded with a smile. He hung the packaged drunkard's peanuts around Pasa's waist. There were also 3 candies inside. He had heard from Pasa that he had 3 children at home. Goodbye. Pasa waved his hand and swayed away. Meg stood at the door and looked on as Pasa disappeared into the street. He made sure that Pasa could go home on his own before turning off the signboard light. This guy is really a strange person. At the entrance of the Titan Tavern, AI Faye's brows furrowed in confusion. Lady Boss, give me another bottle of wine. A shout came from the tavern. Coming. AI Faye hurriedly pushed open the door and continued to busy herself. Where did you go this time? You don't even come back for dinner. You've grown a lot, haven't you? A sturdy woman was standing at the door of an old house. Watching Pasa wobbling towards her, she raised her voice at once while holding a wooden slipper in her hand. 3 little heads poked out from the back of the house and looked at Pasa with pity in their eyes. Chapter 2025. Who are you? Where's my precious Clara? I'm telling you, she's the most beautiful and wonderful woman in the world. Don't stop me from going home. Pasa said seriously as he wobbled over before falling into the woman's arms. Idiot! A shy smile appeared on the woman's face. She patted his butt lightly with the wooden slippers in her hand before helping Pasa into the house. Sit down. I'll boil some water for you to wash your feet, Clara said as she placed Pasa on the bed. Boss Hades didn't lie to me. A man can drink until he's 70% drunk and act until you cry. Pasa opened his eyes to take a glance and praised in his heart. Father, are you peeking at mother secretly? A little head came over, followed by 2 more little heads. Shoo, father brought you delicious food. Pasa took out the peanuts and candies that Mr. Mac had packed for him and passed them to the three children. Okay. The three children took the bag and went to the side to eat happily. Meg closed the door and ended the day's business. No one could find Josh now, but the net had been cast, and the sea was full of fishermen. As long as he still wanted to come out and stir up trouble, he would be caught sooner or later. Given his understanding of Josh, there was no way he would give up after doing so many things after seeing the situation on the Norland continent become so dangerous. Hence, all he had to do now was wait for him to jump out, or kind of find him. Meg turned off the lights outside the door and was about to go upstairs when he turned around to find Irina and the two little ones sitting neatly behind a table, looking at him. What? Do you want supper? Meg asked with a smile. He thought they were already asleep. Supper. Of course, that's fine too. Amy nodded without hesitation. Hot pot is good, Irina said, and nodded. Meow meow. Ugly Duckling also stood up from the chair at the side and agreed. Okay, I'll go prepare the ingredients. Let's eat hot pot. Meg smiled and walked towards the kitchen. By the way, Mother, aren't we looking for Father to discuss how to improve the tavern's business? Amy turned to look at Irina, blinked, and asked. It's okay. Eating hot pot won't affect our conversation, Irina said with a smile. Oh, Amy nodded thoughtfully. Her two short legs dangled in the air, and she suddenly jumped to the ground. She ran to the kitchen door and looked at Meg, who was preparing the ingredients, and said, Father, I want to eat youtiao, the kind that is cooked in a hot pot. Okay, but it will take some time to make the youtiao. It will take a while. Meg promised. Yes, there's no hurry. Father, you're the best. Amy nodded her little head. She ran to get a small stool and sat at the kitchen door, talking to Meg cutely. Because the little one always had new ideas for 3 meals, she might want to eat youtiao, soy milk, durian pizza at any time. So Meg prepared some small portions of semi-finished products in the fridge. For example, the dough needed to make youtiao could be kneaded into thin strips, and the youtiao could be directly fried in a pot of oil. Not long after, a double-flavored pot was placed on the table. Meg came out with 2 large trays of hot pot ingredients, which filled the whole table, including a large plate of golden youtiao. Amy reached out and picked up a section of youtiao, put it to her mouth, and blew on it. Then she took a bite. The youtiao that had just come out of the pot was fragrant and crispy. The little one's lips curled up unconsciously, and she was overflowing with happiness. Meg helped Irina throw a plate of various kinds of mushrooms into the clear soup pot. This was her favorite way of eating. The thick bone broth turned into a mushroom broth, and the taste went up a level. Drinking the broth directly was an extremely delicious experience. It made the originally light soup pot rich, which was in line with her personal taste. Irina picked up a piece of beef roll and dipped it in the clear soup pot. She looked at Meg, who was adding red soup to his dipping sauce, and said, Is this how your tavern is going to be? How is it? Meg tasted his dipping sauce with his chopsticks and nodded with satisfaction. There are no customers every day, so we have nothing to do. Amy swallowed the youtiao in her mouth and looked at Meg with a serious face. We can't be lazy like this. So, how can we get more customers and make more money? Meg knew that in the little one's heart, making more money must be a more important goal. He was very pleased that the little one had such a realistic understanding of making money at such a young age. At least, he didn't have to worry about her lack of money in the future. Of course, the little one sitting on 1 billion yuan would definitely not have to worry about money in this life. Of course, making money was just a hobby. However, this coincided with what Meg was going to do next. The tavern mission had been accepted, and it was now the 3rd day of its opening. The Saipan Tavern was still in the small circle of the Ministry of War. Although the tavern had increased from 2,000 copper coins to more than 10,000, its popularity was still in the single digits. Oh, right after that gentleman drank Mao Tai, the Saipan Tavern gained a little popularity, but it still didn't break through the single digits. What about today's turnover? Irina reached out her hand and looked at Meg with a smile. Here it is. Meg's expression froze a little. He recalled his smug look at the door just now, but he still obediently took out all the turnover from his money bag and handed it to Irina. Irina took the money and put it beside her hand. Her smile got brighter as she looked at Meg and asked, "Do you have any plans?" To be able to make Mamie's the #1 restaurant in Chaos City, gain countless loyal customers, and have a full line every day, Meg's marketing methods were definitely not limited to this. As the saying goes, good wine fears no dark alleys. As a tavern, if you want good business, the key is whether the wine is good or not, Meg said. Don't tell me you want Amy to sit at the door and drink. Irina frowned slightly. Meg had used this trick many times at Mamie's. How can that be? Children can't drink. Meg quickly waved his hand. Then, the aroma of Mao Tai is irresistible to all wine lovers, so from tomorrow onwards, I will pour a glass of Mao Tai and put it at the door of the tavern. It will be locked in a metal cage to attract passing customers and the surrounding residents, Meg said with a smile. Your idea? Irina thought for a while and nodded in agreement. Brilliant. But if there are more customers, you might have to work harder. Because the tavern will only be open for a month, I don't intend to recruit new employees for the time being, Meg said hesitantly. It's all right. I can handle the money. Irina waved her hand calmly. I can act cute to greet the customers. Amy blew on the tripe that Meg had just given her and pouted her little mouth cutely. I can be in charge of serving the dishes, and said as she gestured with her hands. Chapter 2026. News of what happened in Rodu spread like wildfire across the Norland continent. As the heir to the Roth Empire's throne, Josh was actually controlled by the devil. He planned and promoted the war against the orcs and elves single-handedly, ordered the extermination of dozens of orc tribes, and cruelly annihilated the families of several officials in the Ministry of War and killed Bloom. The entire Norland continent was in an uproar. All the races immediately questioned the Roth Empire with the dragons, demanding Andre to hand Josh over to investigate the matter and give the races an explanation. This matter also caused a huge commotion within the Roth Empire. The military, which was forced to take the blame in the beginning, mutinied after Bloom was killed, and there was confirmed news that he had called out Josh's name before he died. Several great generals, led by Marshal Dominic, requested Andre to investigate the matter and give an explanation to the officials in the Ministry of War and Bloom. Overnight, the Roth Empire had changed drastically. Andre sat alone in the royal study, looking at the memorial that Dominic had just submitted. Other than himself, there were also the signatures of the other 3 great generals of the empire. His expression was grave, and the veins on his forehead were throbbing. He was already on the verge of exploding. After a long silence, he finally spoke and said to the door, "Let them in." The door of the royal study was opened, and more than 10 top officials of the Roth Empire filed in. They stood on both sides with complicated expressions. If the Roth Empire could still control the war against the orcs and elves at the same time, then the second Prince Josh's collusion with the devil would shake the foundation of the Roth Empire. Andre's gaze swept across all the officials present, and he said in a deep voice, Josh was disturbed by the devil and committed such a heinous crime. From today onwards, he will be stripped of his position as the prince. All departments will pursue him to bring him to justice and give an explanation to the innocent citizens and officials who died tragically. Many officials heaved a sigh of relief upon hearing that. Your Majesty is wise. All the officials bowed. Andre's declaration meant that Josh had been completely abandoned, and the fight for the throne that had lasted for many years was finally over. Sean would become the future king of the Roth Empire. The officials on Sean's side all had joy and excitement in their eyes. They were originally evenly matched, but Sean won easily because of Josh's foolish actions. Meanwhile, the officials on Josh's side didn't look too good. This incident had shaken the entire Norland continent. Even His Majesty had no choice but to declare his stance, so they naturally didn't dare to be unlucky at such a time. In fact, most people were thinking of how to cut ties with Josh. At a time like this, any relationship with the devil was something that ordinary people couldn't afford. Andre paused for a moment before continuing. I will announce this to the world and make Sean the crown prince. The Roth Empire will be at odds with the devils, and we will fight against the devils together with all the races. We will kill everything related to the devils. This news quickly spread from the Roth Empire's royal palace to the entire Norland continent. It was delivered to everyone who was paying attention to this matter. As expected of the old fox, he's faster and more decisive than I am. His suv is as expected, says twos, expected us to be expected of this is was expected. As expected, he has already lost the space to choose, and taking a step back will lead him into the abyss. Compared to a son who has lost control, it's not difficult to make this decision. Irina only took a glance before lowering her head and continuing to drink her soy milk. That's true. Meg nodded. However, he was still rather satisfied with this outcome. At least, the show they put on that night was very successful and perfectly met his expectations. The world was so big that there was no longer a place for Joshua to stay. To someone who aspired to become the king of the Roth Empire and who loved to show off, this was worse than death. After breakfast, Meg brought Irina and the two children shopping as usual. He didn't have to manage the restaurant and was just so relaxed and comfortable. Of course, whenever he thought of those customers squatting outside the restaurant and waiting for him to return to Chaos City, he would still feel uneasy occasionally. Amy, who was wearing a little rabbit hat, looked up at Meg and asked expectantly, "Father, where are we going to play today?" Meg looked at Amy and said, "Let's go to the bookstore in the west of the city today. I heard that it's the largest bookstore on the Norland continent. There are countless bookstores of different sizes, and you can find any book you want if you put in the effort." Amy's eyes lit up, and she said, "Sure. Then I could buy some pretty picture books. I saw some interesting picture books yesterday." Anne's eyes also lit up at the mention of picture books, and she looked at Meg with anticipation in her eyes. The books, they're only at the level of children's reading. Irina didn't agree with Meg's assessment, but she didn't object to Meg's suggestion either. Meg hailed a horse-drawn carriage and informed the coachman before heading straight to the bookstore in the west of the city. The bookstore in the west of the city was actually a market made up of many bookstores. It could be said that most of the bookstores in Rodu were gathered here, and all of the magazine publishers had also set up their headquarters here. There were bookstores of all sizes. There were large bookstores that were thousands of square meters in size, and small bookstores that had all kinds of ancient books stacked into small mountains within a few square meters. After passing through one alleyway after another, and turning around one corner after another, one might just be able to find the textbook that one had been searching so hard for in an extremely inconspicuous corner. The horse-drawn carriage stopped in front of the largest bookstore in the bookstore, and Meg paid the coachman before expressing his gratitude to him, and everyone alighted from the carriage. "Wow, isn't that father?" Amy jumped down from the horse-drawn carriage and exclaimed at the sight of a portrait of a chef standing in front of the bookstore. Irina and were also quite surprised. It was a magazine cover that was over 2 meters tall, and it was from Whole Foods and Meats. It was a promotional poster for the new magazine. Aside from the words Whole Foods and Meats on the cover, there was also an uncolored sketch of Chef. Regardless of whether it was his clothes or his appearance, he was indeed quite similar to Meg. Of course, the most important thing was that there was a line of text next to the portrait. Norland Continent's #1 chef, Meg. How embarrassing. Meg shook his head. Hee, you should have heard about this already, right? Irina looked at Meg with a hint of a smile on her face, as if she had already seen through his little trick. "I heard that the magazine was going to be released today, but I didn't think that it would be released in such a way." Meg splayed his hands open. If he had known about this, he wouldn't have minded sending a handsome, full-body photo to the editorial department. Only then would he be able to attract more female fans. Chapter 2027. Whole Food Mart must have spent a lot of money on the new issue of the magazine. At the entrance of every bookstore, there were signs with their own drawings. In addition, there was the headline of this issue. Shocking. The father of fried eggplants with fish's first interview did such a thing to the editor. So, did you do something shameful with that editor behind my back? Irina scrutinized Meg. That editor is a man. Meg looked innocent. This headline was really harmful. Why did the shocking news start a spread in this world? A man? Irina's expression was a little strange. It's not what you think. Meg quickly said. What do you think I think? Irina didn't comment. Forget it. I'll go buy a copy to prove my innocence. Meg helplessly walked to the bookstore. He actually wanted to see how this issue of Whole Food Mart was doing and whether it could achieve the publicity effect he expected. Meg and the others didn't leave early. Most of the bookstores in the bookstore were already open. At this time, there were already many customers in this medium-sized bookstore. Meg purposely chose a bookstore that was rather crowded because he wanted to see if Whole Food Mart's reputation was really as strong as those two fellows had boasted. Boss, I want a copy of Whole Food Mart. I want 3 copies of Whole Food Mart. I want 2 copies here, too. As soon as Meg entered the bookstore, he saw a group of people crowding around the counter of the bookstore, shouting as if they were ordering food. So popular? Could it be an act? Meg raised his eyebrows and looked suspiciously at the group of people around the counter, mainly young girls. Little girl, why do you all want to buy this book? Meg moved forward and asked the girl standing at the edge. Uncle, you don't know this, right? This is the first time our Prince Charming has accepted an official interview with a magazine, and it is said that there is a portrait of him in the magazine. The girl looked at him and said excitedly, Prince Charming? Meg frowned. Isn't this a gourmet magazine? Why is there such a thing as a Prince Charming? Of course it's a gourmet magazine. Our Prince Charming is a super amazing chef. He once won the title of the best chef at His Majesty's birthday, but he refused to stay in the imperial kitchen. The eggplant with garlic sauce that he created made vegetarianism break the record for a single issue since its inception. What he created, the girl spoke with great familiarity. The more Meg listened, the stranger his expression became. Why did this plot sound so familiar? Forget it. You won't understand even if I tell you. You don't know how to cook. The girl retracted her gaze with some disdain and said with some elegance, This is the Prince Charming of us foodies, a man who was born to change the world of foodies. Understood, understood. Meg nodded. It was good to be a fan. However, Meg was a little puzzled as he looked at the girls who were buying the magazine enthusiastically. Since his fan base had appeared, why didn't his faith value show any obvious changes? The more than 30,000 fans he had now were all from Chaos City. The god of cookery's faith value is based on the other party's desire to learn from your culinary skills and put it into action. The system's explanation sounded in Meg's mind. So, these people are only after my body? Meg took half a step back and became a little more vigilant. Meg still managed to buy 4 magazines in the end, which could be considered as a wave of support for himself. According to the system, it was not enough to just have fans for looks and talent. He had to convert them into real fans who would take the initiative to try cooking. This was a heavy responsibility and a long way to go. Everyone would collect a bunch of fitness, cooking, and travel tutorials in their favorites, but they would never open it a second time. Yes, it was talking about him. It was self-evident that it was difficult to rely on a magazine to get many people to follow his cooking. Of course, if the magazine circulation was high enough and the reader base was big enough, even if the click rate was low, he could still gain some effective followers. Here, Meg handed one of the magazines to Irina and the other 2 to Amy and Anne. He took one for himself. He had read the draft before and did not feel that there was anything shameful. However, he was a little surprised that Whole Foods and Delicacies used almost the entire cover to promote him. Wow, so handsome. That mustache is so sexy. He's indeed my Prince Charming. Even Her Highness Princess Vanessa is head over heels for him. Worth it, worth it. I'm going to buy 10 more. However, before Meg could flip open the magazine, the girls beside him were already panicking. If I say there's nothing between Vanessa and me, you should believe me, right? Meg said to Irina. Irina lowered her head and flipped through the magazine in her hand. Without even looking up, she said, You and her don't have the guts. Meg's heart warmed instantly. This was trust. He opened the cover and skipped the table of contents. The first page was an interview about him. This interview, written by Milo, was not bad. Of course, This kind of writing was not very impressive to Meg. In addition to some of the issues discussed that day, there were also a few mushy praises at the end. Something like handsome, a gentleman, it was too realistic. TSK, this author, don't tell me he has any thoughts about you. Irina looked up at Meg with a look of disgust. I'll stay away from him next time. Meg nodded. At the end of the article, there was a note. There's a tutorial on eggplant with garlic sauce written by Mr. Meg himself and a portrait of Mr. Meg. Mag glanced at the table of contents and flipped to the second article in the middle. He skipped over the recipe that he had written, and indeed, he saw that very animated portrait. Do you think this is you? Irina glanced at the portrait and asked. Meg pondered for a long time and said, it's a 2D person. It has to satisfy the reader's imagination as much as possible. It doesn't matter if it looks like me or not. Yes, this portrait had nothing to do with him at all. However, it was drawn quite handsomely. As a virtual idol, he could give the artist an extra chicken leg. At least from the reaction of those young girls, it was completely to their liking. Why do you suddenly want to be famous? Irina put away the magazine and looked at Meg with some confusion. Life is always about trying something new. Speak human language. It's simple. I just want to see how famous I can be by cooking, Meg said with a serious face. Irina stared at Meg for a while and nodded. Very good. Chapter 2028. The bookstore in the western part of the city was a paradise for book lovers. As long as you were diligent enough, you could always find the book you wanted. The group of people found a bookstore with no customers, but there were many picture albums on display. The two children were looking for their favorite picture album in the pile of books, while Meg chatted with the bookstore owner. Boss, why don't you sell Whole Food magazine in your store? The other stores are selling very well. Meg glanced at the store and said. The boss looked at the customers who were buying magazines in front of the other bookstores and curled his lips in disdain. What's so good about a gourmet magazine? It won't make much money. If you can get the exclusive rights to sell a few best-selling books, that's called making money. Oh, there are best-selling books? Meg was a little surprised. Although he had collected many ancient books, he didn't know much about the book market in this world. The boss pointed at the bookstore next door that had not opened yet and said, That's right. Do you see that bookstore next door? They only sell 3 books, 1 book every 10 days. They can sell 300,000 copies a month. Just based on this, the boss got married to his 8th wife last month. Meg was surprised and said, You can marry 8 wives here. Your focus seems to be a little different. The boss looked at him strangely. Irina looked over and looked at him with a smile that wasn't a smile. She said, What? You also plan to marry 8 or 10 wives? Meg's face changed slightly. He realized that he had lost his composure and quickly said, No. How could I have such an extravagant and lascivious thought? 8 wives added together can't be as beautiful as you. The boss looked at Irina and said with some envy, Of course. Meg straightened his back a lot. Irina's lips curled up slightly. She withdrew her gaze and picked up a picture album to flip through. Oh yes, boss, what are the best-selling books in this bookstore? Meg asked the boss. If we're talking about the best-selling books, of course, it would be the best-selling books for nights. Alex's Da Vinci books were selling like crazy back then. Men, women, adults, and children were all crazy about Alex's books. Every book sold like hotcakes. Those years of popularity are still unsurpassed today. The colorful storybooks and picture albums with Alex as the main character are even more in short supply. The boss sighed with emotion, and there was a hint of nostalgia in his expression. There's such a thing? Meg raised his eyebrows. Don't tell me you don't even know who Alex is? The boss looked at him with disdain and continued. Back then, he and Princess Irina made a name for themselves on the Norland continent and left behind countless stories and legends. They became important material for countless authors and supported a large number of authors. I just moved from the countryside to the city. Meg nodded. He looked around. But you don't have any picture albums related to him in your shop now? The boss was enlightened. The country bumpkin's words were understandable. He explained, Recently, Alex has reappeared and staged an even more shocking return of the king. He even saved the world single-handedly. He has stirred up waves in the hearts of the Roth Empire's citizens, and his popularity is very high. However, he has rebelled against the Roth Empire. His words and actions are disrespectful to the king. No one would dare to write about him, even if they had the guts. Not to mention us bookstore owners. Who isn't afraid of losing their heads? I see. Meg was deep in thought. He was thinking if he could try to attract attention since his sock puppet was so popular. The boss picked up a picture book from the bookshelf at the door. With a smile, he said, "Night picture books are still our shop's main attraction. Children love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings. Girls love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings and heroes saving the damsel in distress. Men love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings and heroes saving the damsel in distress." Meg glanced at the picture book that the boss gave him. The dragon warrior battling Medusa in the demon's cave. This Meg frowned slightly. Then, he put down the magazine without a change in expression. Seems like it was a rather tragic battle. Hee hee. The boss let out a series of vulgar laughter that all men understood. Meg pretended not to understand and said, "Boss, are the authors popular here? Do they have many fans?" "That depends on the person," the boss said slowly. "Usually, ugly authors don't show their faces. They try their best to create a sense of mystery and give the readers space to imagine. As for handsome authors like you, most of them will find a good artist to draw their portrait in the book. From there, they will attract some fans who are not talented. Of course, there are also some shameless authors who will use women's clothing to sell their looks to retain fans. Of course, this method won't last long. Fans nowadays are all big pig trotters. There are such tricks." Meg was shocked. He didn't expect there to be so many twists and turns. "That's right. Didn't you see the cover of Whole Foods magazine just now? It's really shameless. A gourmet magazine doesn't focus on gourmet food, but actually uses a chef's image as a selling point. Could it be that being handsome can make the dishes better? And maybe that chef looks like a ghost in person," the boss said with a look of disdain. Meg frowned slightly. He felt like he was scolding two people in two sentences. The boss sized up Meg and asked, "Why? You're asking so many questions. Do you want to write too?" I'm just asking casually. It's good that you didn't take it seriously. Writing and drawing comics is a dead end. This isn't something that anyone can do. I've scolded more than 10 artists and scriptwriters in a day." The boss laughed. When he spoke, he was like an old capitalist. Meg casually flipped through the picture albums on the bookshelf and chatted with the boss intermittently. In his mind, he was thinking about the feasibility of turning the cooking tutorial into a picture album. Compared to the immature video transmission technology and somewhat dry text, a picture album with text and a mature operating system and audience, wouldn't it be a suitable way to spread the word? The two little girls chose a pile of picture albums. What was rare was that, and took more picture albums than Amy. There were dozens of them. It was obvious that the little girl liked picture albums. After paying the bill and leaving, the group strolled around the bookstore for half a day. Meg also bought a lot of ancient books and best-selling novels. In a small bookstore in the corner, he even secretly bought a Alex de Ginci novel from the boss. Amy stopped and looked back at Meg. "Father, I'm hungry. What are we eating for lunch today?" Chapter 2029. Reading one's own book must be a very shameful experience. That's it. Meg had only skimmed through that book of dragon-slaying warriors fighting huge, evil dragons, and it was already relegated to the corner of history. Be it the story or the style, they were all inferior. It was hard to imagine that a book of this standard could be hidden away and sold by the shop owner like a treasure. Of course, this could also be determined by the rarity of the subject matter. After lunch, everyone went back to the restaurant. The two little fellows were reading the new sketchbook that they had just bought with relish. Irina had something to do, so Mag was left alone to read the few ancient books that he had gotten today out of boredom. With the book in his hand, Meg's mind was not on it. Instead, he was thinking about Josh's next move. It had been a few days since the battle between the Roth Empire, the Orcs, and the Elves. The originally tense situation had become even more complicated because of Josh's incident. The orcs, who had dozens of their tribes wiped out, were obviously not going to let the matter rest just because Josh was controlled by the devil. The elves, who had almost lost their city of life, were also going to demand an explanation. Andre did not give any direct response to this. The number of soldiers sent to the border was even increasing, and the situation was still tense. Now that Josh was wanted by the entire continent, it could be said that he was the enemy of the entire world. With so many eyes on him, it would be difficult for him to do anything big. However, it was still troublesome that they could not find any trace of him. "Father, look. This is Big Sister Anne's painting." Amy's voice interrupted Meg's thoughts. He looked down at the painting in front of him, and his eyes lit up. It was a drawing of a silver-haired fairy. It was drawn with a watercolor pen, and it was AI me. The painting style was young, but it was precisely because of this that it looked cute and childlike. Moreover, every stroke was very smooth, and there was no stiffness at all. It made the character look lively and cute. "Wow, this is great." Meg looked at Anne with surprise. "Is this Anne's first time drawing?" And smiled and nodded. "Yes, I only know how to draw circles that aren't too round, but Big Sister Anne already knows how to draw me," Amy said proudly, as if she had contributed to this. What an extraordinary talent in painting. Meg rubbed his chin. Looking at Anne, his eyes lit up. "And are you interested in becoming a cartoonist?" And tilted her head and looked at Meg. She didn't seem to understand what Meg said. Meg explained, "Manga artists are professional artists who draw comic books. These comic books were created by manga artists." Anne's eyes lit up. She nodded and said with sign language, "I'm willing." Meg smiled and said, "That's good. You can continue to draw according to your preferences. If you're really interested, I'll give you a script later. You can draw a story according to the script." And nodded obediently. She sat down and flipped through the comic book. Then, she picked up the watercolor pen beside her and continued to draw. "In this case, the Little Master of China project. Can I start it?" Meg rubbed his chin and fell into deep thought. "Father, remember to attract customers today," Amy whispered when she saw Meg in a daze. If Amy didn't mention it, I would have forgotten. Meg smiled and rubbed the little girl's head. He got up and walked to the wine cabinet. From the bottom of the wine cabinet, he took out a small bottle of Maudai wine that Irina drank the day before yesterday. He opened the bottle cap and poured a small cup into a small jar that looked like a small incense burner. The small semi-sealed jar had a few fine holes on it. It was just enough to let the fragrance of the wine out, but it wouldn't disappear all of a sudden. Fishing for drunkards was the same principle as fishing. First, build a nest and use the fragrance of the wine to attract drunkards to gather. Once people gathered, there would be no lack of customers. This method was somewhat different from opening a restaurant. After all, as long as the restaurant wasn't a roadside stall, it wouldn't be easy to attract customers from far and near with the fragrance. Mag went out with a specially made wine goblet and a small iron cage in his hand. He placed the goblet in the cage and put a small lock on it before hanging it on the pillar at the door. The rich fragrance of the Maudai wine slowly drifted out. Although it spread very slowly and the fragrance was diluted a lot, it still continued to spread out with a stable and unique fragrance. The faint fragrance of the wine was centered around the Saipan Tavern and slowly spread to the surroundings. "It smells so good. Is this the fragrance of wine?" "Yeah, it smells like wine, but there's no wine with such a rich fragrance." When the customers passed by, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. They were surprised at where the fragrance of the wine came from. Some of the wine lovers followed the fragrance of the wine and found the small iron cage hanging in front of the Saipan Tavern. "What is this operation? Why did they lock up the wine? This is a new tavern, right? I've never heard of it before. Could it be that they want to use the fragrance of the wine to attract customers?" People are attracted, but the tavern isn't open yet. It only opens at 6 p.m. Many passers-by followed the fragrance of the wine and gathered at the entrance of the tavern. They looked at the small wine cup in the iron cage and swallowed their saliva. But when they saw the wooden sign hanging on the door that said the opening hours, they felt helpless. "Lady Boss, look, There are many customers gathered at the entrance of the tavern across the street. In the Titan Tavern, the waiter looked at AI, Faye, who just came down from her afternoon nap, and said, "Their family finally opened for business?" AI Faye stretched her back and smiled lazily. Her lithe figure was accentuated by her loose, cotton clothes. According to her observations over the past few days, this Saipan Tavern was like a child's play. The opening hours were extremely short, and there were very few customers. It was clear that they were only doing business because of their interest. No, it seems that the owner put a jug of wine at the entrance, and it attracted the customers. The waiter shook his head. A jug of wine? AI Faye was a little surprised. She quickly walked to the entrance of the tavern and looked at the dozen or so people gathered in front of the Saipan Tavern diagonally across the street. They were indeed surrounding a small iron cage hanging on a pillar at the entrance of the tavern. Her nose twitched, and her brows furrowed slightly. Even though they were quite far away, there was still a faint fragrance of wine in the air. As a woman who had inherited the family business and managed the Titan Tavern for more than 10 years, even though she couldn't personally brew any fine wine, she was still quite knowledgeable about wine. She had never heard of a wine that could emit such a fragrant aroma from such a distance. AI, Faye murmured, "With such fine wine in hand, this Saipan Tavern will definitely have a place in the tavern world of Romo Street, let alone Romo Street." "Boss, what did you say?" The waiter didn't hear her clearly. "Nothing. Just be more respectful when you see the owner of the tavern across the street in the future." AI Faye withdrew her gaze and gave the waiter some instructions before turning to enter the tavern. "Even if I can't get him, I have to get his wine." Chapter 2030. The plan to attract customers with the aroma of wine was a success. Before the tavern opened for business, there were more than a dozen customers waiting at the entrance of the Saipan Tavern. Of course, they were only interested customers. The price of a bottle of wine was 2,000 copper coins, so some customers would be filtered out. Those who stayed were the real customers. Irina was not back yet, and went upstairs to draw. Meg looked at Amy and said with a smile, "Amy, today we will be the ones to receive the customers." "Okay." Amy nodded obediently and clenched her little fist. "I will treat them gently." Meg smiled and opened the door of the tavern. Looking at the dozen or so customers waiting outside, he said, "Sorry for the wait." "Welcome. Boss, your opening time is really on point. We have been waiting here for so long, but you didn't even let us go in first." A customer complained. If it wasn't for the aroma of the wine being so tempting, he would have never been treated like this. The other customers also complained a few times. The tavern opens on time every day. Customers only need to wait for the sun to set. Meg said calmly. The opening time would not be changed. This was the tavern's rule. Although everyone was a little unhappy with Mag's stiff reply, since the tavern was already open, they didn't have to wait at the door anymore. They all went in one after another to try the intoxicating wine. Maudai wine, 2,000 copper coins a bottle. Whiskey, 2,000 copper coins a bottle. People quickly saw the prices of the two wines and several side dishes in the conspicuous places behind the wine cabinet. "So expensive," someone exclaimed. There were not many taverns on Romo Street, and the prices were generally cheap. Generally, it was only a few dozen copper coins to a little more than 100 copper coins a bottle. But the two wines in this tavern were actually as expensive as 2,000 copper coins a bottle. "Boss, do you sell your wine by the jar?" a customer asked. "It's on the wine cabinet." Meg pointed at the wine cabinet inside, which was filled with two kinds of wine. "It's a little expensive for such a small bottle. I have a friend coming over. I'll go pick him up first." What a coincidence, I have a friend too. In the blink of an eye, there were only 3 or 4 customers left in the tavern. A man in an official's robe looked at Meg and asked, "Boss, what kind of wine are you hanging at the door?" "It's Maudai." Meg pointed at the round Maudai bottle on the wine cabinet. "I want a bottle of this Maudai wine and a set of dishes," the man said, and sat down with the other men. Since someone had placed an order, only those who could afford 2,000 copper coins a bottle of wine remained. They also ordered Maudai and sat down. 2,000 copper coins for a bottle of wine was considered expensive on Romo Street, but in the famous taverns and pubs in the north of the city, such a price was not eye-catching. The aroma of the wine was what attracted these customers to take a seat and order a bottle to try. On Romo Street, a black carriage was moving slowly. Abraham sat in the carriage with a grave expression on his face. He had just come out from the Ministry of War. Because of Josh's matter, this was the first time he had stepped into the Ministry of War. However, things were as bad as he had heard. Josh was no longer the Josh he knew, and he could not stand up for Andre's decision. Demons, what a terrifying existence. He did not know how Josh had provoked demons, and perhaps no one would know either. There was nothing he could do about it at the moment, and he did not even know how to explain it to Vanessa. All he wanted now was to find a place to drink some wine and be alone. Just then, a whiff of wine aroma wafted in from outside the carriage. What is this smell? Abraham's nose twitched, and he lifted a corner of the curtain in surprise. The aroma of wine wafted in his face, and the words Saipan Tavern came into his sight. "Stop the carriage," Abraham said. The carriage drove forward for a while before stopping. Abraham said, "Turn around and go to the tavern at the back." The carriage turned around and stopped in front of Saipan Tavern. Abraham alighted from the carriage and looked at the rather new tavern. His eyes were quickly attracted by the small iron cage hanging on the pillar at the entrance. There was a glass of wine inside, and the alluring aroma came from that small glass. Isn't this aroma a little too strong and alluring? Abraham went up to take a sniff, then pushed the door open and walked into the tavern. Since he wanted a drink, he would drink something good. If he was going to get drunk, he might as well lose to good wine. There were not many people in the tavern, but as soon as Abraham entered, he almost fainted from the strong aroma of the wine. It was the same wine that he had smelled at the entrance, but the wine in the tavern was even stronger and more alluring. The customers who had ordered the wine were all sipping and tasting it. From their expressions, he could tell that the wine was indeed good, and it was not just the aroma. Amy looked at Abraham, and her eyes lit up. She opened her mouth to call for someone. "What would you like to drink?" Meg just came out of the kitchen with a plate of cold pig's ears. His eyes lit up when he saw Abraham, and he asked calmly. Amy looked at Meg, and as if she suddenly thought of something, she obediently shut her mouth and did not say anything. Abraham glanced at the pig's ear salad on the tray in Meg's hand. He was a little shocked that this red salad looked very similar to the husband and wife lung slice. Even the spiciness was similar. He glanced at the wine list on the wall and said, "Give me a bottle of wine that's the same as theirs and a set of side dishes for the wine." "Okay." Meg nodded and went to serve the dishes. Abraham retracted his gaze and was about to find a place to sit down when he saw the quiet little girl sitting behind the wine cabinet. The little girl looked to be only 4 or 5 years old. She had a delicate appearance, long black hair, and a pair of bright black eyes. She sat quietly and was obedient and cute. I didn't expect the boss to have such an obedient and cute daughter. Abraham couldn't help but think of Mamie's. He wondered where little boss and Mr. Mac were now. He really missed Mamie's food. "Hello, little girl." Abraham smiled and greeted her. "Hello, Grandpa Fatty." Amy greeted him obediently. "How dare you?" The guard's face turned cold. This little girl actually dared to address the Duke in such a manner. "He yelled at me," Amy immediately said with an aggrieved expression. Her big eyes were glistening with tears. "What does this have to do with you? Get out." Abraham turned around and kicked the guard's butt, chasing him out. He then looked at Amy with a smile and coaxed, "Good girl, don't be afraid. Grandpa Fatty just kicked him out." "Okay." Amy's face immediately showed an angelic smile. Abraham heaved a sigh of relief and looked around. Fortunately, this was not Mamie's. Otherwise, little boss would not have said that she was afraid. She would have greeted him with a fireball. Chapter 2031. The tavern style and atmosphere made Abraham feel very comfortable. There weren't many people sitting around. Perhaps it was because the wine was too delicious, or perhaps it was because these people couldn't hold their liquor but there were already a few drunken customers in the tavern. It wasn't as noisy as normal taverns. Abraham chose a corner seat and sat alone with his face facing the wall. He didn't have to worry about being recognized or disturbed. He just wanted to drink some wine alone and not think about anything else. If he got drunk, he would go back to sleep and think about other things when he woke up the next day. Not long after, Meg placed 3 dishes and a bottle of Mau Tai in front of Abraham. "Thanks." Abraham thanked him casually, but his eyes were already attracted by the 3 dishes in front of him. The peanuts were skinned and stir-fried, and they were wrapped in chili and white sugar. All kinds of spices had already seeped into the peanuts, and they were crispy and fragrant. They looked pretty good. "Let's try these drunkard's peanuts first." Abraham picked up a peanut and threw it into his mouth. Crunch! The peanut's crispy texture exploded in his mouth with just a light bite. The spiciness and fragrance of the spices that had already permeated the peanuts also blossomed. It was a small peanut, but it contained so many flavors and variations. The more he chewed, the more fragrant it became. It was truly astonishing. Incredible. A small peanut can be fried to such a delectable level, and it really does go well with wine. The spicy taste blossomed on his lips, and Abraham unconsciously opened the wine beside him as he marveled at the wonderful taste of the drunkard's peanuts. The clear wine was poured into a crystal glass, and the rich aroma of the wine wafted into his nostrils as he picked up the glass. Even Abraham, who wasn't a big fan of wine, couldn't help but want to praise good wine. Abraham knew a thing or two about wine tasting. He didn't pick up the glass and drink it in one gulp. Instead, he took a deep breath of the wine's aroma and let it swirl in his mind before he took a small sip. The warm and delicate wine moistened his lips before sliding into his mouth. It was rich and fragrant, and the taste was refreshing and refreshing. It complemented the drunkard's peanuts very well, and after swallowing, the fragrance lingered in his mouth and teeth. Who would have thought that there would be such a long wait in this world? Even the fine wines offered by the various lands paled in comparison to this. Abraham was astonished. He had tasted many of the fine wines offered to the king over the years, but none of them had given him as much of a shock as this Mau Tai. He couldn't help but take another sip. This time, he closed his eyes and savored the various flavors of the wine. It didn't have the sweetness of fruit wine, nor did it have the bitterness of grain wine that was hard to swallow. He didn't know what the winemaker had used or what he had added to make the wine so enchanting that it made people want to be intoxicated. Then, he couldn't help but think of the past. Back in the day, the struggle for the throne had been a bloody one. Now, Josh and Sean had embarked on the same path, and Josh had gone astray because of it, stepping into a never-ending abyss. And sighed. Abraham sighed and sniffed to control his emotions. He put down the wine glass, and his gaze landed on the cold mixed pig's ears and cold mixed pig's tongue at the side. To be honest, the first time he saw these 2 dishes, he thought of Mamie's. He thought of the cold mixed dish with the same red color, husband and wife lung slice. The familiar spicy taste, and the ingredients that normal people wouldn't dare to serve. Pig's ears and pig's tongue. He wouldn't have doubted if these were Mr. Mac's new dishes that had just come out. But in a newly opened tavern like Rodu, these 2 strange dishes actually appeared. It really surprised him. Could it be that the owner went to Mamie's to get scriptures? Abraham looked back at the wine cabinet suspiciously. The owner of the tavern was sitting behind the counter, reading a book calmly. With Mr. Mac's busy life, it's impossible for him to be so carefree in this lifetime. Abraham retracted his gaze and picked up a piece of pig's tongue with his chopsticks. After Abraham's view of food was remolded by Mamie's, he was extremely tolerant of these strange foods. After all, he could chew roasted pig's eyes until his mouth was full. Pig's tongue and pig's ears were simply watery. He picked up a piece of pig's tongue that was wrapped in chili oil. It felt like lean meat through the chopsticks. After cutting it into thin slices, it didn't look disgusting at all. It was just like sliced beef. It was wrapped in chili oil and decorated with some cooked sesame seeds. Instead, it felt rather tempting. Abraham couldn't help but put the pig's tongue into his mouth and then took a bite. The spicy chili oil exploded in his mouth first, and the rich aroma and spiciness blossomed on the tip of his tongue. Then, the taste of the pig's tongue blossomed. The fragrance of the braised meat, coupled with the unique texture of the pig's tongue, was more springy than beef. It was juicier when chewed, and the fragrance of the braised meat had completely permeated the tongue. It was spicy and fresh, and the taste buds welcomed a long-lost thrill and frenzy. Rip! Abraham felt a button on his clothes suddenly burst open for a long time, and his innermost thermal clothes directly burst open. This, damn it! Did he steal Mr. Mac's chili sauce bun? How can it be so delicious? Abraham was dumbfounded. He looked at the plate of cold pig's tongue in front of him with a face of disbelief. Compared to wine tasting, food was his true field of expertise. In this lonely little street, in a newly opened little pub, he actually ate food that was comparable to Mamie's. Oh my God, if the owner didn't go and learn from Mr. Mac, then he must be a genius. Abraham took a small sip of wine, suppressed the shock in his heart, and looked at the cold pig's ear at the side. The pig's ear was also wrapped in chili oil. It was a bright red color, sprinkled with cooked sesame seeds, and looked very appetizing. Without hesitation, he picked up a pig's ear and put it into his mouth. The spicy taste was still the same, but the unique crispy bone of the pig's ear gave him an extremely wonderful chewy texture. The soft pig's ear meat sandwiched the thin crispy bone, and when chewing, he could hear the crisp sound of chewing. This is too good. Abraham raised his eyebrows, and he felt his entire mental state relax a lot. Indeed, food was the most healing. However, good wine was a perfect match. A small sip of wine, a mouthful of food, and drinking alone, but it was still delicious. At this time, a group of middle-aged men in official uniforms walked into the pub, found a table for 8, and sat down. They ordered a few bottles of wine and a few dishes to go with the wine. A middle-aged official with a potbelly pointed at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said, "That little brat, come and pour wine for the masters." Chapter 2032. During this period of time, the Roth Empire was in turmoil. Apart from the Ministry of War, which was at the center of the storm, the Ministry of Law, which specialized in prisons, was also very busy. All of the prisons in Rodu were packed to the brim. In order to catch the culprit behind the murder of the Minister of War's entire family, almost all of the criminals in Rodu had been thoroughly searched, and many old cases had been resolved. After the king announced Josh as the culprit yesterday, the burden on the Ministry of Law's shoulders was finally lifted. Today, the officials of the Ministry of Justice had decided to come out for a drink. They had heard from the people from the Ministry of War that a new tavern had opened on Romo Street, and that the wine inside was a rare brew. The group had come with the intention of taking a look. As soon as they entered, the aroma of the wine was indeed alluring. However, when they saw the shabby decor, many people frowned, but they still sat down for the sake of the wine. Aldan was the third in command of the Ministry of Law, and he was the one who organized this gathering. Most of the people who came were also his trusted subordinates. After holding back his anger for a few days, he came to drink and relax. In his opinion, this tavern was a little terrible. The price of the wine was not low, but there were only 2 or 3 shabby dishes. Even things like peanuts, pig's ears, and pig's tongue were served on the table. However, it was Sir Joseph who decided to come to this tavern. As the second in command of the Ministry of Law, Joseph had joined them at the last minute, so Aldan naturally couldn't reject him. However, the service in this tavern was really terrible. There wasn't even a waiter to pour the wine. One had to know that in other taverns, when they saw the group of people enter, the shopkeeper would personally wait at the side to pour wine for them. Hence, his gaze landed on the little girl sitting behind the counter. Although this little girl was a little young, she was quite adorable. Letting her pour the wine would make the mood better. Hence, Aldan ordered Amy arrogantly, "That little brat, come and pour wine for us." Aldan's voice wasn't soft, and many people in the tavern turned to look. Many people had noticed the boss's adorable little girl just now. She was only 3 or 4 years old, but someone actually made such an unreasonable request of her to pour wine. However, when they turned back and saw Aldan and his group, they all retracted their gazes. The Ministry of Justice was also feared by many officials in the officialdom. After all, being targeted by them was never a good thing. Joseph frowned when he heard this. He glanced at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said, "Forget it. She's so young. How can she carry a bottle of wine? Your Excellency, there's no need for pity. It's just a bottle of wine." Since they can't afford a waiter, they should at least find someone to pour wine for us. Aldan smiled and waved his hand. He looked at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said coldly, "Little brat, can't you hear me?" "Brat? Are you talking about me?" Amy rested her chin on her hands and looked at Alden with confusion. "Is there anyone younger than you here?" Alden glared. "Here." Amy picked up Ugly Duckling from a nearby chair. "So you're calling it." "Howl." Ugly Duckling, who had been dressed up as a red panda, yawned and continued to sleep on the counter. When the crowd saw this scene, they all let out smiles. "Why you're messing with me?" Alden's face darkened. No one dared to mess with him in front of so many people. Amy shook her head with a serious expression. She waved her hand and said, "You don't look easy to mess with." Alden slammed the table and stood up. "Bastard, do you know who I am?" "Your Excellency, since you're an official, it's not very appropriate for you to make such a request to a child." Meg walked out of the kitchen with a cleaver in his hand. He stood beside Amy and looked at Alden. Fortunately, Irina wasn't in the tavern at the moment. Otherwise, the folding chair would have sent this fatty, who had quite a bit of authority, to the ground. The customers in the shop looked at Aldan with disdain. How could a burly official be so rude and unreasonable to an eccentric little girl? How despicable! Alden was so angry that he laughed. He looked at Meg and said, "You unruly commoner. We're officials of the Ministry of Law. It's our fortune to be served by wine. Aren't you afraid that I'll shut down your little tavern and throw the two of you in jail?" "That's right. Do you really think you're something when you run a small tavern? Hurry up and apologize to His Excellency Alden. Otherwise, he'll shut down your tavern. It'll only take a word from him." A few officials at the same table chimed in. They hadn't seen such an arrogant person in a long time. When the customers heard that, their expressions changed slightly. They all looked away to prevent themselves from being implicated. Joseph was a little displeased when he heard that. However, after a moment of hesitation, he still didn't say anything. Meg pursed his lips. He waved the cleaver in his hand, wondering if he should still keep the tavern. "Shut down, shut down, shut down your mother." Right at this moment, a cursing voice sounded from the corner. A fat figure rushed out from the corner. With a smack, he threw a half-eaten plate of cold pig ears at Alden's face. Smack! The plate fell to the ground with a crisp sound. The tavern fell silent instantly. Everyone was shocked as they looked at Aldan, whose face was covered in red oil and pig ears, with a dumbfounded expression. This was an official of the Ministry of Law. He was of high status and had a high status. "Sir!" The officials at the same table were also stunned. They didn't expect that there would be someone who dared to treat Alden like this in a small tavern. This fatty is in big trouble. Everyone looked at the fat man dressed like a rich merchant and couldn't help but worry. Although he did what everyone wanted to do, he also got himself into big trouble. "Fuck!" Alden snapped back to his senses and flew into a rage. "Duke! Duke!" Joseph suddenly stood up and exclaimed at the sight of Abraham, who was dressed like a wealthy man. "Duke? Sir?" Aldan choked on the words he was about to say. He took off the pig's ear that was covering his eyes and took a good look at the fat man's face. His legs gave way, and he knelt down on the broken plate on the ground. Duke Abraham. He was one of the noblest people in the Roth Empire. He was also the king's most trusted and favorite brother. Although he had almost no real power or position, everyone knew that his position in His Majesty's heart was far above that of the other dukes. When His Majesty was able to become king, Duke Abraham had made great contributions to His Majesty. Although he was the third in command of the Ministry of Law, his position was nothing in front of this duke. "Duke!" The officials at the same table hurriedly stood up and bowed respectfully to Abraham. This duke hadn't been involved in politics for many years, so they didn't recognize him immediately. "Lord from the Ministry of Law, may I have the honor of pouring wine for you?" Abraham asked with a half-smile as he took the silk handkerchief from the butler and wiped the red oil off his hands. Chapter 2033. Alden was dumbfounded. All he did was show off his authority in a small tavern. He never thought that he would provoke the smiling tiger Abraham. His face was already swollen and painful. There were even a few pig ears on his face. The red oil flowed down his neck and dripped onto his official robe, but he didn't dare to wipe it off. Abraham was famous for his good temper, but anyone who was old or had reached a certain position knew that he was the one who killed his two elder brothers to help his majesty ascend to the throne. He was a ruthless man. I wouldn't dare. Alden quickly shook his head, sweat dripping from his forehead. As an experienced official, he still had the basic ability to read people's expressions. He could tell that Abraham was not in a good mood. Joseph also quickly said, "Duke, you must be joking. How could we let you pour wine for us? We didn't notice you were in the tavern. Otherwise, we would have all come to propose a toast to you." The officials from the Ministry of Justice all agreed. They were all panicking and no longer had their previous arrogance. "So it's Duke Abraham. I didn't expect him to be drinking here." "That's right. These lords have kicked an iron plate. If that's the case, then this tavern must have quite the backing. Even Lord Abraham is backing them." The customers in the tavern were shocked by Abraham's identity. At the same time, they looked at Alden and the others as if they were watching a good show. The more arrogant they were before, the more embarrassed they were now. This reversal was pleasing to the eyes. Abraham looked at Alden, who was kneeling on the ground, and sneered, "I think you're all used to being officials. You think that everyone has to bow down to you when you're outside, right? Even such a small and cute girl has to pour wine for you? Duke, please listen to me." "Boo-hoo, he's so fierce. I'm so scared." Amy, who had been holding her cheeks and watching the show, suddenly turned around and hugged Meg's arm. She said cutely, tears glistening in her big eyes, don't be scared." Meg glanced at Amy. Since when did this little rascal become so good at acting? She was already putting on an act. Look at how scared the little girl is. "What are you trying to say?" Abraham kicked Alden to the ground and became even more furious. He already had a ball of fire in his heart, and this incident had made him even angrier. Now that Alden was here, he might as well find something to vent his anger on. Alden didn't dare to fight back after being beaten up. He didn't even try to dodge. Even his cries were muffled. The expressions of Joseph and the others changed slightly as they watched from the side. However, no one dared to step forward to stop or mediate. Given Abraham's status, even if they were officials of the Ministry of Justice, it wouldn't matter if they were beaten up. At most, His Majesty would scold them a little, but there was no way he would do anything to the Duke because of them. Alden had gotten himself into trouble because of his mouth. At least Abraham wouldn't beat him to death on the spot. Abraham was a little tired from the beating, so he stopped. He looked at Alden, who was lying on the ground with his hands covering his crotch, and said, "Today's incident is over. Let me tell you, from now on, this tavern will be under my protection. If any of you need someone to pour you a drink, come and find me. I guarantee that you'll be satisfied." Everyone quickly shook their heads. Who would dare to ask this fiend to pour a drink? Mag was also looking at Abraham with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He didn't think that Abraham would be so domineering after returning to his home turf. However, it was a good thing for Saipan Tavern to have the protection of a duke like this. "I didn't expect to be able to ride on his coattails so quickly." Meg nodded. It was naturally best that he didn't have to deal with some small problems personally. With Alden as an example, no one would dare to cause trouble in the tavern for a long time. "You wasted a plate of my pig ears salad. I'll take this one." Abraham took a plate of pig ears salad from the table. After thinking for a while, he took a plate of pig tongue salad. Joseph and the others naturally didn't dare to say anything. "Little girl, don't be afraid. With Grandpa Fatty here, no one will dare to bully you in the future." Abraham strode over to the counter with a smile, completely devoid of his previous domineering demeanor. Yes, thank you, Grandpa Fatty. Grandpa Fatty is mighty and domineering. Amy nodded her little head and looked at him with admiration. Her little mouth was as sweet as honey. Abraham returned to his seat with satisfaction. He smiled and muttered to himself, "This little girl's words are so nice. If only Boss Amy could speak half as well." Alden was helped up from the ground. Someone took out a silk handkerchief and wiped off the pig ears and red oil hanging on his face. There was still a clear plate mark on his face. It was green here and there, and there was purple there. He looked quite miserable. "Oh, I won't be drinking with all of you today." Alden was completely humiliated. His entire body was in pain, and he wanted to find a healing magician to heal him as soon as possible. "Let me send Lord Alden out." An official helped Alden out. The others knew that Alden couldn't sit still, but they couldn't leave. If they left, wouldn't it be obvious that they were unhappy with Abraham? Abraham took a mop and cleaned the red oil on the floor so that the other customers wouldn't slip and fall. Joseph and the others looked at Meg in a different light. A mysterious tavern owner's daughter dared to call Duke Abraham Grandpa Fatty. Who is this guy? If I tell you, you'll be scared shitless. Meg's lips curled. He knew what these people were thinking. After Alden left, Joseph and the others drank with some restraint. Although they had good wine in hand, they didn't feel like drinking it. Abraham was drunk. Alone, he drank half a bottle of Maudai and ate 6 plates of appetizers. "The Duke helped me a lot earlier. This meal is free of charge," Meg said to the butler who was about to pay the bill. The butler looked at Meg and nodded. "Okay, I'll let the Duke know." Meg smiled as he watched the 4 big men come in and carry Abraham out. This was the benefit of a rich and powerful man going out. Even if he was drunk, there would be people to carry him back. After Abraham left, the half-drunk Joseph and the others also paid the bill and left. At 9:30, Meg sent the last drunk customer out of the restaurant. He flipped the sign hanging on the door and announced the end of business for the day. "Mr. Mack, can we still go in and have a drink?" An old man and a young man standing at the door asked Meg with a smile. Chapter 2034. After a few days of recuperation, Melante's injuries were almost healed. Moreover, he could eat the delicacies that Meg sent to him every day. The originally skinny Melanie had gained a lot of weight. His complexion was rosy, and he looked healthier than before he was injured. However, because of this, he lost some of his ghost aura and looked like an ordinary old man. "Come in." Meg naturally would not refuse their request to come in for a drink. Since Melante's injuries had recovered, it was time for him to continue searching for Joshua. He was a large-scale human radar. "What would you like to drink?" Meg closed the door and asked with a smile. "Mr. Mack, the wine you gave me last time. My grandpa has been scolding me for days, saying that I wasted good wine," Noah said with a bitter face. Noah had a bitter look on his face. Because of that small pot of wine, he had received a lot of love education from his grandfather these days. "Mautai, right? Have a seat first. I'll prepare some dishes to go with the wine." Meg nodded and turned to go into the kitchen. After a while, Meg came out with 3 dishes and a bottle of Mautai. Noah was being pulled by Amy to play with her knitting. "You're so stupid. You can't even do this." "Oh my God, it's not like this. You have to cross over first." "You're so stupid. Not this one, that one. You're so stupid." Amy, who had no talent in knitting, finally found the joy of the game when she met Noah, who had no talent at all. "It seems like I'm really stupid." Noah's eyes widened as he looked at the messy knitting in his hands and fell into deep thought. Melanie crossed his legs and looked at Amy and Noah with a smile. He was just like an old man. He did not have the temperament of a big boss of the Ghost Clan. "Old man, how's your injury?" Meg opened the wine cork and poured a glass for Melanie. "It's completely healed. I can do whatever I want," Melanie answered, but his eyes were completely attracted by the wine in the glass in front of him. This wine was extremely fragrant. Even though he had lived for 700 years, he had never smelled such a rich and alluring wine aroma. Therefore, after drinking a few drops of the remaining wine in the bottle that day, he could not forget about it until today. Earlier, when he smelled the fragrance of the wine from the street, he could not hold himself back and waited until the tavern closed before he came to ask for a cup of wine. Come, let's have a toast. Meg could see that his mind was on the wine, so he was not in a hurry to talk about business. Thank you for saving my life and for your hospitality during this period of time, Melander said to Mag solemnly as he raised his wine glass. You're welcome. Meg clinked glasses with him and took a sip. Melander picked up his wine glass and downed it in one gulp. This wine was sweet and soft as it entered the throat. Its mellow fragrance spread out in the mouth like a dense fog, causing one to sink deep into it. Good wine. Melanti opened his eyes after a long time and let out a long sigh of satisfaction. He had never drunk such good wine in his life. After drinking a cup of wine, he felt a little lightheaded. A warm feeling rose from the bottom of his heart, and his whole body felt very comfortable. Meg filled his glass again and said with a smile, If the old man likes it, feel free to drink. There's more wine. Then this old man won't hold back. Melander picked up his wine glass and downed it in one gulp. He had not touched a single drop of wine during these days of recuperation, so his alcohol addiction was already difficult to bear. I want some too, Noah said in a small voice, reaching out to grab the wine bottle. Children don't drink wine. You're in charge of pouring the wine. Go get yourself some water. Melander raised his head and looked at him. I'm already an adult, Noah argued. Melander curled his lips and said, That's according to a person's age. In the Ghost Clan, you're only an infant. You're not even as old as Little Boss. Noah was speechless for a moment. Amy, who was drinking freshly squeezed juice at the side, had her eyes lit up. She looked at Noah with a smile and said, Really? Then, can I call you Little Brother Noah from now on? You can't. Little Brother Noah. I already said you can't. Little Brother Noah, be good. Amy reached out and patted Noah's head. Then, she really took out a piece of candy and handed it to Noah. I don't want it. Noah wanted to cry, but had no tears to shed. Amy said with a serious expression, This is plum candy. It's sweet and sour. It's super delicious. You definitely haven't eaten it before. Really? Noah looked at the candy lying in Amy's small palm and gulped. Here, smell it. Amy tore open the packaging and leaned in front of Noah. The faint sour smell of plums wafted out. Gulp. Noah swallowed his saliva. It really was the sweet and sour taste of plums. Here. Amy poured the candy from her palm into Noah's hand. After a moment of hesitation, Noah still tossed the plum candy into his mouth. The sweet and sour taste made his expression twist instantly. However, after he got used to it quickly, he found the taste to be quite fascinating. Amy looked at him with a smile and said, Since you've eaten my candy, you'll be my little brother from now on. Huh? Noah's face was full of question marks. Father said that you can't beat me, so just accept your fate. Amy was still smiling, but in Noah's eyes, it had become a little devil smile. Like father, like daughter. Although Amy was only 4 years old, she was Alex and Irina's daughter. Such a terrifying combination product must be someone with extraordinary talent. Otherwise, Crassus and Julian wouldn't have fought to take her in as their disciple. As for whether she was really more powerful than him, after coming to Rodu, he had already heard the news of her defeating an 8th-tier magic caster and becoming the champion of the magic caster tournament. So, it's all a plum candy's fault that I become your little brother? Noah was a little sad. Look up. It's okay, little brother she. Big sister Amy will take care of you in the future, Amy said maturely as she was very satisfied with this little brother that she had just taken in. Noah didn't have any doubts about that. This was a monster who could defeat an 8th-tier magic caster at the age of 4. She might even become a great magic caster before she was 10 years old. Moreover, she was a super second-generation magic caster who excelled in both close combat and long-range magic. Her father was the most powerful man in the world, and her mother was the most beautiful woman in the world. Really, even the princess of the Roth Empire couldn't compare to her. Of course, if he knew that the Archbishop of the Holy See was looking for her everywhere to be the saintess, he would definitely kneel even faster. As they drank, Meg didn't talk about anything serious with Melant. Anyway, if he talked about it now, he would forget about it the next day. So, he might as well not waste his breath. After drinking half a bottle of Maotai, Melant collapsed on the table drunk. Meg put down the half-empty glass of wine in his hand and said to Noah, "Come over for breakfast tomorrow morning. We'll talk about it tomorrow." "All right." Noah, who hadn't touched the wine, left with Melant on his back. Amy looked at Meg, who had closed the door, and asked expectantly, "Father, did I do well today?" "Yes, Amy did very well. I'll reward you with a big drumstick tomorrow." Meg nodded. The little fellow's acting today was so natural that no one would associate her with the fierce little boss who was collecting money with her hands behind her back. "Amy likes big drumsticks," Amy said with a smile on her face as she nodded her little head. Chapter 2035. Many changes had occurred in the City of Life recently. Many landlords and nobles had burned the slave contracts, allowing many elves to regain their freedom. Furthermore, some slave owners had given some land and property to their former servants, allowing them to establish themselves in the City of Life. Of course, not all elven nobles were willing to give up all their privileges and return to being ordinary. Hence, protests of various sizes began to appear in the City of Life and the Wind Forest. Elven slaves attacked the nobles' warehouses and territories, snatching their slave contracts in an attempt to end their lives as slaves. Meanwhile, the night elves began to become active, secretly helping the slaves fight for their freedom. This movement was like a raging fire that instantly engulfed the Wind Forest. It was already out of control. To everyone's surprise, Helena didn't intervene at all. In fact, the guards didn't even provide any help to the slave masters who were asking for help. In the Starry Cave, High Priestess, all the major families have been robbed and slaves have escaped. Please order the guards to attack and capture those rioters. If this continues, the Wind Forest will really collapse. A middle-aged elf looked worriedly at Helena, who was sitting on the high platform. There were a few other elven nobles in the cave, and they were also looking at Helena worriedly. The Wind Forest system was collapsing, and Helena, who had single-handedly built this system, was ignoring this terrifying movement. Helena was silent for a long time. She slowly turned around and looked down at the elven nobles and lords below. Her gaze was cold and had a hint of mockery. The elves all looked away and lowered their heads. "If you had worked hard and fulfilled the agreement I made with you back then, and were absolutely loyal to Her Majesty and the elven race, this wouldn't have happened today. I've thought it through these days. It's not my fault, nor is it the system. It's because I chose you greedy fellows back then. Since it's your fault, someone has to bear the consequences to appease the anger of our people." Irina's cold voice echoed in the cave, and a wall of light rose up from the entrance of the cave. "Plop, High Priestess, please forgive us. We're loyal to you and the elven race. Please spare us, High Priestess." The elves in the cave immediately fell to their knees and begged for mercy. "Save those words for when you apologize to your brethren." Helena waved a hand, and 2 teams of guards stepped forward to tie up all of the elves present. The sound of begging gradually disappeared outside the cave, and the starry cavern mansion soon regained its tranquility. Cutting off your arm to survive? You really don't hesitate at all." A chuckle sounded in the cave, and a figure wearing a silver dress slowly walked in from the entrance of the cave. "I could do anything for the elven race, let alone getting rid of a few vermin." Helena looked at Irina, who had stopped in her tracks. Irina said mockingly, "Then you should commit suicide first to atone for your sins. After all, these vermin were specially selected and fattened by you. Now you're using them as scapegoats. This method is so inferior that it doesn't seem like something a high priest would do." Helena wasn't enraged by Irina's words, and she replied calmly, "I've given my all for the elven race, and I have a clear conscience. Whether it's right or wrong will be left for future generations to judge. But now I have to lead the elf race into the next stage. You've already lost that right. I'm still standing here, and no one is more qualified than me. I'm going to make the elven race great again, Helena said confidently. Irina said coldly, back then, our brethren chose you and Her Majesty to lead them out of the dark era. In the past 100 years, you've plunged most of our brethren into an even darker era. Now, everything is over, and our brethren have woken up. However, most of them have chosen to stand against the system you're so proud of, yet you still refuse to admit your mistakes. What do you have to talk about making the elven race great again? This time, I'll choose a ruling class that will satisfy them. Even if Her Majesty were standing here right now, she would still stand on my side. Helena's brows furrowed. You're wrong. The elven race doesn't need a ruling class. What can make the elven race great again isn't some powerful guards or impenetrable fortress. What can make the elven race great again is freedom, equality, and the determination of all elves to protect the wind forest. A magic caster's staff appeared in Irina's hand. Just like what you're doing now, Irina looked down at Irina. I'm very surprised that you didn't bring Alex with you this time. That's my business. I don't need him to do anything for me, although he's already done enough for me, Irina said calmly. You're the most talented elf we've seen in the past 1,000 years. You once had the chance to lead the elven race to a greater future. The Queen and I have high hopes for you, but you fell in love with a human and even gave birth to a bastard child with him. This is an unforgivable betrayal. Helena's face was filled with anger. That's a bit too much for you to care about. Irina smiled. Furthermore, meeting him is the greatest fortune of my life. As for that child, it's the best gift the god of life has given us. Actually, I sometimes think that maybe it's because you've never met a man who loves you in your life that you've become such a paranoid old woman. You talk too much. I'm here to fight you, not to argue. Irina interrupted Helena. She took a step forward with her magic caster's staff and disappeared on the spot. Then, she appeared above the platform with both hands holding the magic caster's staff and smashed it down toward Helena's head. The starry sky crystal ball hovering in front of Helena floated up and formed a starry sky barrier. The magic caster's staff smashed onto the starry sky barrier with a dull thud. The barrier shook violently and then dissipated. The force of the magic caster's staff was also completely neutralized. However, holy light erupted at this moment. That night, a terrifying battle erupted in the starry sky cave abode. The tree of life shone brightly, and a green ray of light connected to the starry sky cave abode like a silk thread. This battle lasted for more than an hour before it ended. The starry sky cave abode collapsed, and a purple-striped griffin landed in the rubble and left with Irina. The elves dug out the severely injured Helena from the rubble. Old, which is still something, Irina lay on the purple-striped griffin's back, and her eyes gradually became misty. Then she fell unconscious. Ow! Hazi looked back with concern. It flapped its wings with all its might and flew toward Rodu. Chapter 2036. Meg sensed Aziz's aura and went up to the roof. He saw Aziz swooping down and Irina lying on its back. Are you hurt? Meg hurriedly carried Irina down from Aziz's back. He didn't see any obvious injuries on her body, and her breathing was still stable. She was just unconscious. Aziz, go out of the city first. Don't go too far. Stay at the same place. Meg instructed Aziz. Aziz nodded. It flapped its wings and disappeared into the sky. Meg carried Irina downstairs and gently placed her on the bed. Did she go to fight? Meg looked at Irina, who was still unconscious, and said in his mind, System, help me check if she's hurt. Is her life in danger? Irina, female, 30 years old, elf, physical condition, overuse of magic. Many soft tissue injuries have been repaired. Body in a protective dormant state. Nothing serious. The system's report quickly appeared in Meg's mind. Then she should be fine after sleeping. Meg nodded and covered her with a blanket. The wind forest was Helena's home ground. In fact, it was also Irina's home ground with the help of the Tree of Life. As for the result of this battle, he could only ask Irina when she woke up tomorrow. Rodu in the church's main hall. Pope, we don't know where the saintess is. What should we do? The archbishop asked the pope. The pope smiled and said, Don't worry about this. God has his own plans. She didn't come because it's not time yet. But now that the devil has appeared and bewitched the world, even the second prince has been bewitched and controlled. God hasn't given a decree yet. The archbishop said hesitantly, God has already given a decree. The saintess is the most important existence to solve this catastrophe. The pope shook his head slightly. Find her, persuade her, and let her lead the church to solve this catastrophe. Protecting this world is our most important thing now. But she's a half-elf after all. I'm afraid, Your Majesty. The pope looked at him meaningfully and said, You must remember that the Holy See has never existed for the sake of imperial power. When we first established imperial power, it was only to better protect the human race. August tribe. An orc looked at Oster anxiously and said, Chief, more than half of the orc tribes that originally belonged to us have defected to the Fok tribe. If we don't do anything, I'm afraid the Fok tribe will have the final say among the orcs in the future. Oster, who had lost an arm, frowned. What can we do? That orc choked. This time, the Fok tribe had helped the other tribes and gained the favor of many tribes. Meanwhile, the August tribe had missed the initial opportunity. Now that the other tribes were siding with the Fok tribe, there wasn't much they could do. Unless we kill Connie and plunge the Fok tribe into chaos again, or we side with the August tribe. Oster had a cruel smile on his face. But Chief, the orc wanted to say something, but stopped. Oster waved his hand and said, I've made up my mind. If we don't get rid of Connie, the August tribe will never be able to rise again. In the north, above the vast snowfield, a frost dragon slowly glided over the snowy plains, its gaze sweeping across the ground. Father, where are you? The heart-wrenching groan reverberated in the air, but there was no response. Meg made a pot of Buddha jumps over the wall for Irina overnight. When she woke up the next morning, she had a bowl of porridge first and could drink the Buddha jumps over the wall that had just been stewed. So extravagant. Irina ate the abalone in small bites as she looked at Meg in surprise. Meg shrugged helplessly and said, You don't want me to fight with you, so I can only do logistics. Irina curled her lips and said, It's not like we can't beat them. You don't have to bring me along. Meg looked at her seriously and said, Anyway, if you fight again, you have to bring me along. Even if I don't fight, I can stand guard at the side for you. Okay, Irina agreed casually. Amy lifted her head from a bowl and also said seriously, You have to bring me along, too. I can fight very well. How many do you want to fight, Irina? Irina tilted her head and asked with a smile. Isn't 10 too few? Amy asked. Normally, there should be at least a few dozen. Meg listened to the conversation between the mother and daughter and lowered his head to eat his porridge silently. She really didn't give men a way out at all. Irina didn't say much about the situation last night. She only said that Helena's injuries weren't lighter than hers and would probably stop for a while. However, the revolution and uprising in the Wind Forest had already reached a critical point. Helena wanted to take advantage of the chaos to select a new batch of ruling class and change their skin to continue the class rule. This was something that Irina would never agree to or allow. Meg was a complete newbie in this aspect, so he didn't give her any suggestions. Not long after, Noah and Melander also came. After breakfast, Meg and Melander confirmed the direction of their search. Their primary goal was to find Josh, and then follow the clues to find the devil that escaped from the seal. Compared to that, everything else was trivial. Once those sealed devils were released, the Norland continent would welcome its doomsday. Amy passed the bowl in her hand to Noah and patted his shoulder as she said, Follow me, and I'll let you do the cleaning. I won't mistreat you. Noah. Melander, who had recovered, would continue to search for the demonic aura with Rodu as the center. After this incident, Meg wasn't sure if Josh was still in Rodu. Apart from Josh, How to overturn the Edward family's rule over the Roth Empire was also a problem that Meg had been thinking about recently. In order to spread the Chaos City model to the entire Norland continent and completely solve the problem of racial wars, they would have to deepen the reform of the various races that were originally fixed. With Andre's current centralization of power, and Sean, who might inherit the throne in the future, it was obviously impossible for them to do that. What they wanted was to conquer the entire world and become the monarch of the Norland continent, making all the races submit to them. In comparison, even letting Vanessa be the queen as a transition is not a bad choice. Meg was deep in thought. Of course, overturning an empire wasn't a small matter. The difficulty level was much higher than killing Josh. However, there was good news today. Meg's faith points finally exceeded 100,000 on the third day of the release of the All Cuisine magazine. Meg's path to becoming the god of cookery had also increased by 2 levels. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the reward, Pasta Experience Bag. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the ability, Spiritual Control. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the item, Mysterious Rolling Pin X1. No pop-up window. Chapter 2037. Meg was a little overwhelmed by the system's continuous mission rewards. It was as if he had received an unexpected windfall, or rather, a considerable amount of after-bed income. Meg opened the large pasta gift pack. There were soup dumplings, shaved noodles, hot dry noodles, and fried rice noodles in chili oil. 4 rather comprehensive pasta dishes, and the fried rice noodles in chili oil were Meg's favorite. These 4 pasta dishes could make their breakfast more sumptuous and provide more choices for the guests. For example, when they didn't feel like eating, they could have a bowl of hot dry noodles or 2 steaming soup dumplings. The system was surprisingly generous. Then Meg checked the so-called mind control skill. It sounded like a shameful skill that could compete with Time Stop. Fortunately, it fell into the hands of an upright person like Meg. However, after a deeper understanding, it was more of a temporary stun skill than a mind control skill, as well as a strong immunity to mental skills. That's it? That's all time control is? It's far from Time Stop, right? Meg was a little disappointed. However, this was an upgradable skill. As long as the host's mental strength was strong enough, the skill could become more powerful. Of course, Meg was more concerned about the immunity to mental skills. When he could slash the whole world with a kitchen knife, the only thing that posed the most threat to him was the Great Old Ones. And mind control was the ability that the Great Old Ones were best at and the most troublesome. Even the current Meg was worried that he would fall for it if he wasn't careful. Tentacle monster plus mind control. Look, this kind of natural abnormality was so invincible. As for the mysterious rolling pin, it was actually a wooden club that could be big, small, waterproof, and adapt to all kinds of situations. Of course, Meg didn't know why the system had to specifically mark it as waterproof. However, with so many pasta dishes to make, the rolling pin was a basic tool and indispensable. After breakfast, Amy suddenly said, "Father, mother, sister, and drew a picture book yesterday. I'll show it to you." "Oh, really?" Meg was a little surprised, and smiled shyly and nodded. Irina looked at and expectantly. "Hasn't learned how to draw? I'd like to take a look. I'll go get it." Amy turned around and ran upstairs. Soon, she came back down with a sketchbook in her arms. There was a beautiful mermaid on the cover of the album. She had a huge and colorful blue fishtail, red wavy hair, and a beautiful face. One could even see some resemblance of Gina. She leaned against the reef, and the rippling ocean spread out. The story of a mermaid, this was Anne's favorite fairy tale. Wow, Meg's eyes lit up. This was drawn by the mermaid. Unfortunately, he was uncultured. She could walk the world with the word pretty. It's much better than the cover of most of the albums I saw the other day. It's drawn very well, Irina also praised. Meg took the album and flipped it open. It was indeed the story of the mermaid. The rippling ocean, the gorgeous ship sailing on the sea, the flying seagulls, the dolphins leaping out of the sea. Whether it was the scenery or the characters, They were all drawn very well. If there was a flaw, it would be that the storyboard was a little weak, making the plot not look as smooth. But for a beginner, the flaws could not obscure the beauty. This level of completion was already shocking enough. Yes, on the second day of learning how to draw, and completed a complete version of the mermaid by herself. What was this? This was a genius. An amazing talent for drawing, as well as a tentacle monster's hand speed that all cartoonists envied. With this kind of talent, she was destined to become an excellent cartoonist. The drawing is very good. It's beautiful, interesting, and the story is well told. Meg looked at Anne with gratification, as if he had found an excellent child laborer. The smile on Anne's face became brighter, as if she had never been so happy before. Meg put down the album, looked at Anne, and said, "However, it would be great if we could add in a segment where the little prince cooks for the Little Mermaid. That would explain why the Little Mermaid fell in love with the little prince and why she loved him so deeply." And tilted her head and thought. Her eyes gradually lit up, and she nodded with a smile, agreeing with Meg's suggestion. However, and quickly asked Meg in sign language, "What dish does the little prince want to cook?" "Spicy grilled fish." Meg did not hesitate. And the others looked at Meg. "It's not very suitable." Meg thought for a while and said, "Then make braised pork." "Why braised pork?" Amy asked. Meg smiled and said, "Because the Little Mermaid has never eaten pork or seen a pig run." So, when she ate braised pork, she was shocked and fell in love with the little prince. But Gina's favorite is beggar's chicken. Irina raised her doubts. And Amy nodded in agreement. Sister Gina loved to eat beggar's chicken. She even gnawed on the mud casing. This is a work of art. Letting the beautiful Miss Mermaid gnaw on the mud casing is a little unsightly. Meg shook his head. Of course, he was mainly worried that people would not be able to learn how to cook a high-end dish like beggar's chicken. Just adding a layer of mud casing to the chicken would probably cause many accidents. As for braised pork, it was indeed a simple and quick dish. Yes, after seeing the finished product that Anne had drawn, he had already decided to insert an advertisement in The Mermaid. A Whole Foods magazine had allowed him to level up twice and obtain many rewards. He had tasted the sweetness of success. So, he put a lot of effort into increasing his conviction. This was a proper after-sleep income. The ratio of investment to output was amazing. Meg's explanation sounded reasonable and successfully convinced the three of them, and decided to add a segment of the Little Prince making braised pork in the comic. Meg was very attentive to this. He specially demonstrated a simplified version of braised pork too, and on the spot. At the same time, he madly hinted to and that this was the soul of the entire comic. It had to be realistic and detailed. It would be best if the audience could copy it through the comic. At the same time, he also tactfully pointed out some of the storyboard problems in Anne's comic. Meg was not a cartoonist, but he had grown up with all kinds of comics. His ability to appreciate comics was still online, and went upstairs to continue her creation. She was really a hard-working little cartoonist. Is this also one of your plans to expand your influence? Irina looked at Meg with a half-smile. Meg smiled and said, "I just want to add a core competitiveness to my child's comic. A competitiveness that no one else can imitate. Yes, a priceless recipe for braised pork." Meg wanted to use and to expand his influence while also giving Anne's comic a strong core. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.